Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for your patience. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Johnson. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 113, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Ms. Eddie Bernice Johnson of Texas.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentlelady for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and ranking member. And I'd like to thank the persons who have worked to pull this language together. That includes Congressman Bobby Rush, Congressman G.K. Butterfield, Congressman English, Congressman Lujan, and Congressman Gordon. The committee who worked together in a bipartisan fashion to perhaps strengthen, in their opinion, this language. I appreciate the time that many have spent here. When the chair came to the Congressional Black Caucus, I had to leave and go to the doctor about this voice that you hear, so I didn't get a chance to hear all the discussion. But energy innovation hubs have the potential for transformative research that will yield breakthroughs in technology that can help meet our energy and climate challenges. This research will ultimately yield new technologies, which will create new jobs for American families. To ensure diversity within the hubs, my amendment calls for priority consideration with HBCUs, 1890 land-grant institutions, Hispanic serving institutions, PBIs, and tribal colleges. Together, these are hundreds of universities which represent our nation. And let me say, too, that this amendment in no way will affect, determine, or change the location of these hubs. These universities maintain unique relationships with communities of color, and we should implement their ability to educate these communities on the opportunities in green industry and the techniques needed to succeed to a larger energy strategy. And I know that everybody gets tired of me bringing this kind of thing up, but I want to say that we can't simply walk away and not let a population this large not have an opportunity to be on course for the future. The development of green energy centers of excellence at minority-serving institutions to research and develop new green technologies, as well as train implementers in the deployment of green innovation, is a more towards parity in a growing clean energy economy. Historically, most HBCUs and other minority-serving institutions do not have the same endowments, funding, grant writing capabilities, and luxuries other universities have. Despite these challenges, however, statistics show that HBCUs have managed to graduate students in STEM fields at a higher rate than most traditional universities. The bills up for consideration today focus on particular weaknesses in our national scientific enterprise. I and many of my colleagues from the Congressional Black Caucus, Congressional Hispanic Caucus, and the Diversity and Innovation Caucus, and others believe this amendment will strengthen the intent of the legislation. We have seen the statistics showing minorities are falling behind the rest of the pack in the sciences for many reasons. I ask my colleagues on this committee to support this amendment and increase the diversity in our growing clean energy economy. I in no way asking that there be any special preparations. Everyone should be able to compete at that level, but should be given an opportunity. And this is really for our nation because we are far behind. This is America Competes, and it must include all Americans. And I appreciate any support that I can get. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. You have been a champion here, and you're correct. This is an amendment for all Americans. We're all going to be better off. Anyone else wish to comment? If not, then there's no further discussion. Oh, Mr. Hall is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, at the committee, this amendment, the amendment in the bill, referred to consideration as special consideration, and it's used that way in two other parts of the bill. And now it says priority consideration. I'm not sure what the difference is in it, but seem like they ought to either all be priority, they ought to all be special, and ought to have it said what priority means.
If the gentleman would yield, I think the basis of this is that we're bringing bills, or this bill is a culmination of coming from 3 different subcommittees. But I'll yield to the council to address those definitions.
We're aware of the term special consideration appearing in the U.S. Code something like 130 times. The term priority consideration appears in the U.S. Code something like 60 times. We're unaware of any place in the U.S. Code where either term is defined. So that's where we're at.
What would an amendment be in? It seems to me in this particular bill, it's mentioned special 2 other times, and then another area it mentioned priority. It looks like they ought to be the same, and they really ought to be defined.
I can't speak to the use of the term in this amendment versus other amendments, but in both cases, I think there is an implication that there would be some level of additional consideration. What that might mean in terms of priority versus special would probably be at the discretion of the secretary.
If the gentleman would yield, I think you raise a good concern about consistency. Why don't we try to work on it between now and the going to the floor, and see if those folks that had an interest in these particular interest, most of this is the language that came out of their amendments, and we'll see if we can't come up with some common term.
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, Dr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to further ask the council, if I may, could this be interpreted as particularly discrimination for these minorities in selecting in selection or anything else? Is this specific preference given to these individuals where preference is given?
I don't think
this is more of a legislative question than
yeah.
a council question, and I think really you have a situation where there's mandates and then there's something less than. This is certainly not a mandate, a requirement, a quota, or anything of that nature. So it would be less than.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In fact, that's what I was getting at. Yeah. Is this a mandate?
No.
That we give preference to these groups of people? Because I don't believe in discrimination for or against anybody. I think we ought to have equal opportunity for everyone, and we ought to be all treated equal under the law. And I appreciate the chairman, and I appreciate councils, and I hope we can define this, Mr. Chairman, as we go forward. Thank you, sir.
Ms. Johnson
Yes.
is recognized.
Thank you for that question. In my mind, in clarification, it is to sensitize, but offer no special preparation. They have to be the same as everyone else, but to remember to be inclusive. That's all that.
Would the gentlelady?
Yes.
Thank you, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. We ought to all have the same opportunities, no matter what our color of the skin is, no matter what gender we are, no matter whatever kind of inherent quality we are given by our Creator. I agree. We all ought to have equal opportunity, and I agree with the gentlelady. Thank you.
Thank you.
Will the gentlelady yield?
Yes.
Thank you. My question is just, we talked a lot about special consideration. Would priority be higher than that or lower? I guess
I wasn't there when they were talking about this in the committee. To be honest with you, I don't think it makes much difference. It probably made 2 or 3 members of the Congressional Black Caucus feel better, but I don't think it makes that much difference.
If the gentlelady that is our impression, in that, as the gentlelady, Ms. Johnson, said, it's a level of sensitivity, but it's not a mandate, and my feelings is that it really isn't a distinction.
Okay. Thank you.
So if there is no further discussion then, if there's no further discussion, the vote occurs on Ms. Johnson's amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by a gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hall. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
I think I am. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 022, time stamped April 26, 2010, 11:59 a.m. Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Hall of Texas.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would add R&D on conventional energy sources to the list of eligible activities that energy innovation hubs can pursue. And when it comes to energy policy, quote, energy independence, quote, is a lofty but common goal that both parties generally agree should be a top priority. In order to reduce imports of foreign energy and achieve true energy independence, we need to do two things. One, reduce demand by advancing energy efficiency and alternative sources, and two, increase supply and production of our domestic energy resources. Unfortunately, and increasingly, we seem to be forgetting the supply side of this equation. The Energy Innovation Hubs program authorizes in Title VI of this bill does not authorize R&D on, quote, advanced energy technology, quotes closed, but then limits the definition of these technologies to those that advance energy efficiency and certain alternative energy sources. If we're truly serious about energy independence, it doesn't make sense to exclude R&D on fossil fuels that could increase domestic energy supplies and production and reduce foreign imports. A little bit of federal investment in this area could go a long way. We've seen the firsthand ever over the last decade. We've seen this with the explosion of domestic energy production enabled by advances in ultra-deep drilling technology. This committee passed some 3.5 years ago, and it has been working up to now. We should not exclude this type of energy from research from the program, and so any amendment, especially this amendment, simply builds on all of the above approach to energy independence by adding technologies with the potential to enhance domestic energy supply and production, including those relating to coal, oil, and natural gas, to the list of eligible activities under this program. Now yield back my time.
Governor Germandi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. If I might, it seems, my recollection is that there is an extraordinarily large amount of money that's going into the coal and oil research already from a different organization, different part of the Department of Energy. To you, Mr. Chairman, or perhaps Mr. Hall, is that the case, and if so, how much? And instead of taking this limited source of money and using it for what is already being done in other parts of the Department of Energy.
Gentleman yield.
Yes.
It's my understanding, maybe I'm wrong, that they're cutting fossil fuels that I'm referring to here, and a lot of it from R&D. Isn't that your understanding?
Gentlemen, my understanding is there's a lot of money for carbon capture and sequestration in the coal area. But in terms of natural gas, we're seeing a lot of new reserves that come about. We're finding out that there's a lot of natural gas that could be under the tundra, under the ocean. There are concerns about some of the processes of getting natural gas out. So I think that as a transition fuel, that I don't think there is that kind of research going in natural gas. In CCS, there is a lot of money. And once again, this is not a mandate. This is just, in essence, allows the secretary, if there is a good idea that comes down the pike in these fields, to be able to accept them.
Would Chairman yield?
It's Mr. Governor Germandi.
Would you yield? We're just adding these to where they won't cut it out, where they won't leave it, where it could consider this too is added to the list that they could consider.
Well, if I'll just close on this and just state my concern here is that the oil and coal industry has been very successful in capturing national subsidies, tax subsidies, and other kinds of subsidies to advance their interests. My personal interest is to advance the other technologies. The point about natural gas was well made by the chairman. My concern would be that the oil and coal industry might use this language to grab this piece of money, which I believe, at least for me, is intended for other technologies, other kinds of fuel sources. So I'll let it go at that.
Well, I would just say, if the governor would yield, it really won't be up to the companies. It'll be up to the secretary. And the secretary might want to spend some money on how you might make this cleaner. type of expiration.
Mr. Chairman, thank you.
So if there is no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Peters. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
I am, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 033, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Peters of Michigan.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The legislation we are considering today will create new energy innovation hubs that will spur advancements in the growth in the field of advanced energy technologies. These hubs will encourage and support new partnerships in regions that conduct multidisciplinary research and work collaboratively towards the commercialization of new energy technologies, and I applaud the committee for including this important new initiative in the Competes Act. As we work to find solutions that will put our nation on a course towards energy independence, it is important that we acknowledge the role our transportation sector is going to play in this. And that is why I'm offering an amendment that will include technologies that relate to advanced vehicle and vehicle components to the definition of advanced energy technologies supported under this section. This simple amendment assures that we support the development of new vehicle technologies that result in energy savings within these newly created energy hubs, and this will include innovations in drivetrain technologies, hydrogen, fuel cells, or improvements to internal combustion engines. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank Representative Inglis for his work on this issue and for his work helping in this amendment, and I also would like to thank him for his support in working to develop new advanced technologies. I think we all agree that having a vibrant transportation sector is vital to our national economy, and would urge all of my colleagues to adopt this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Is there further discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Inglis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Peters, for your shared interest in improving vehicle technologies. This is a good amendment, and one that will make it clear that we want to improve the vehicle technologies so that we can someday be free of Middle Eastern oil. And so it's also a tremendous opportunity for our economy. Not only is it a national security risk, but there's an opportunity for job creation, especially in places like the 4th District of South Carolina, where the International Center for Automotive Research is stretching the boundaries of advanced technology research through a unique partnership between industry, academia, and the government. And so the Energy Innovation Hubs present a similar opportunity to leverage these kind of efforts to solve the key problems in transportation, including vehicles and vehicle components, alternative fuels, and related technologies that truly can transform the industry and reignite U.S. leadership in this field. So I think this is a very strong amendment, and I encourage my colleagues to support it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Dr. Baird is recognized.
Yes, I just want to do two things. Commend my colleagues for what I think is a very constructive amendment, and also compliment my friend and ranking member who earlier I mentioned that Dr. Lipinski finished second. I believe Mr. Inglis finished fourth in today's race. So, Mr. Chairman, we've got good people. Of course, we always follow in your footsteps when you're in a race, but in your absence, we're doing well on this committee on a bipartisan basis.
Is there further discussion?
Mr. Gordon. Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to congratulate Mr. Peters for this amendment. We have, in my district at Braselton, Georgia, at Road Atlanta, we've got a company that's doing advanced vehicle technology. They're utilizing race cars in trying to develop these technologies. It's absolutely critical that we go forward with this type of thing, and I want to add my very enthusiastic support for this amendment. I congratulate for you bringing it. And so, Mr. Chairman, I agree and like it. I yield back.
We're glad to have you with us. Is there further discussion on the amendment? If not, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. The next amendment on the amendment is agreed to. The next amendment is on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Biggert. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 100, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mrs. Biggert of Illinois.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading, and without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentlelady for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment is straightforward. It simply clarifies that federally funded research and development centers are eligible to compete for the energy innovation hubs. I believe it's important that our labs are eligible to compete for the hubs, and more importantly, I believe it's essential to the hubs to utilize existing resources within the DOE complex, the modeling and simulation hub or the battery hub, for example, and as well as there is work on the automotive, Mr. Peters' amendment, which could qualify using a using the labs and I think that this would make very quickly we would be able to address these issues and when we would have the lab participation and existing facilities that won't have to be built or moved to another location to do this. So I would thank your consideration and yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Biggert. You're correct that the labs are an outstanding resource for our country, and we certainly need to be utilized. There's no further discussion. Then the vote occurs on the gentlelady's amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is offered by the gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Lujan. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment? The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 048, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Lujan of New Mexico.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am pleased to introduce this amendment that I believe will support and spur innovation, support small business, and create jobs. Enhanced innovation and improved competitiveness will require non-federal entities, U.S. industry and small businesses to work in partnership with federal R&D entities such as the DOE National Labs. Cooperative arrangements between public and private entities are thus an important mechanism for innovation and competitiveness. Every year across the many DOE national laboratories, there are many potential cooperative work agreements that go unrealized because the non-federal partner, often a small business, does not have the means for both the federal portion as well as their own portion of the work. CRADAs are cooperative work agreements between a national lab and a non-federal entity. They're a mechanism by which basic science capability or technology that has been developed at a national laboratory can be matured in cooperation with a non-federal entity. Often these are initiated by a small business that sees a capability at a national lab that the small business believes can be turned into a marketable technology. By statute, a CRADA must be consistent with the laboratory's mission. Both parties may contribute personnel, services, property to the CRADA project, and the partner can provide funding for the laboratory's research. However, the DOE laboratory cannot provide funding to the partner. To encourage DOE's laboratories to enter into technology partnerships, Congress began providing support specifically designated for federal portions of CRADAs in fiscal year 91. However, in fiscal year 96, Congress began to phase out these dedicated funds, relying instead on program managers at the laboratories to use their regular research funds for CRADAs. As a result, the number of CRADAs dropped dramatically as the dedicated federal funding declined. Using data from the 2006 technology report from DOE, the number of CRADAs dropped from nearly 1,600 in 1996, when dedicated federal funding was at its peak, to about 600 in 2001, when dedicated federal funding was eliminated. That is a drop of nearly 2/3, demonstrating that other funding mechanisms, which have other priorities and demands, do not adequately support the full potential CRADA work with the industry. Currently, there are no funds dedicated to paying for the National Labs portion of CRADAs. And an April 2010 report from the Energy Technology Innovation Policy Research Group at Harvard stated that CRADAs and cooperative agreements involve closer coordination between parties than grants or work for other agreements. This is important for energy innovation because, as they stated, public-private partnerships increase the funding available to projects at expertise and other resources and help bring technology into use. This means that in most cases, the small businesses will need to pay 100% of the cost, both their own as well as the cost of the national lab. The national lab cost represents a large financial barrier especially given the risk of not knowing whether the matured capability will be successfully marketable. Many potential CRADAs never materialize because the financial risk is too great. And in 2002, the GAO report stated that managers at DOE laboratories most frequently cited the lack of dedicated funding for technology partnerships, including funding targeted to small businesses, as the most important barrier to their technology transfer activities. Moreover, they reported that managers at 8 of 12 DOE laboratories we surveyed cited the lack of dedicated DOE funding for CRADAs as an important barrier that has constrained technology partnerships at their laboratories. In developing this amendment, we worked with committee staff and sent draft language to DOE for technical comments. A number of their suggestions were included in this amendment. Language that ensures small businesses will be given special consideration in deciding which CRADAs will receive funds, and we also authorize such sums as the administration deems necessary rather than authorizing a specific sum. This language does not prejudge the analysis of the new DOE Technology Transfer Coordinator, who is currently undertaking this endeavor to understand the resources necessary to optimize technology transfer and cooperative research efforts. To summarize, this amendment will enhance the cooperative agreements between DOE national labs and small businesses, and in doing so will spur innovation, support small businesses, and create jobs. I urge my colleagues to support this important amendment, and I thank you for your consideration. I yield back my time.
I think you have a secondary amendment.
Yes,
Or
Mr.
before you do
Chairman.
that, I think Mr. Garamani, or Governor Garamani, want to speak to it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Lujan. This is an extremely important aspect of what needs to be done. Our national labs are an extraordinary resource, and incredible technology potential exists at those labs. This is a tool that could be used by the lab directors and the secretary in moving that technology, that innovation out of the labs. I'm working on an additional program with Mr. Lujan that would allow the national labs to set up adjacent to the laboratories space that could be used in cooperative arrangements, not funded directly by the labs, but in these kinds of partnerships, some of which could be these CRADA programs. That's an issue for another day. That'll be taken up in a separate piece of legislation. But those facilities adjacent to the labs would provide this location for perhaps some programs that would be created under this kind of this amendment. I support the amendment. I yield back my time.
If there's no further discussion on the amendment, then I yield to Ms. Biggert for a secondary amendment, and the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 103, amendment offered by Mrs. Biggert of Illinois to amendment offered by Mr. Lujan of New Mexico.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentlelady for 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support the Lujan amendment. I think that it will enhance the cooperative agreements between DOE national labs and small businesses, and in doing so will help spur innovation, support small businesses, and create jobs. But my amendment would prohibit the funding from the Office of Science from being used to pay for the federal share of cooperative research development agreements. And I certainly appreciate the concept behind Mr. Lujan's amendment. Funding for these agreements certainly has diminished substantially in recent years, deterring labs from utilizing relationships with industry. And I'd like to see this change, like Mr. Lujan, but I think that it could use a little bit more work. Specifically, I'd like to see more emphasis on the research projects spread across all programs within DOE, and perhaps we should include some oversight. I don't think that there's much in there, and then and direction through the tech transfer coordinator at DOE, and not have the funding just come out of science, but really through the programs and projects that are established within the Department of Energy. And I hope that the gentleman would work with me to improve this provision of the bill, and would yield back.
And Mr. Lujan, what is your opinion?
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and I appreciate as well Ms. Biggert's support for our national laboratories and the need for innovation, and I appreciate very much this amendment, which I am not opposed to, and I'd be willing to work with Ms. Biggert. When we look at the section of United States Code where cooperative research and development agreements were outlined and created, there is some enumerated authority that I think we could lean to, Mr. Chairman, if there is further clarification that's needed. I think that it works well the way it is. And I also want to make sure that as we look to the funding that goes to the Office of Science, that we're able to target that to do exactly that work. But on the other side, that we're able to work in a way where we can help accelerate the movement of the commercialization of this technology and the transfer of it, so we can help get that out there and make sure that we look to strengthen these partnerships, which were strong in the 1990s. They did well. There was a lot of positive work, but we need to make sure that they're strengthened yet again. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
So as I understand it, you're supporting this amendment, and if there needs to be some massaging, that you'll work together as you go forward. So if there's no further discussion, the vote is on the Biggert secondary amendment. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The amendment passes. Now the vote is on the Mr. Lujan's amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. The opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Maryland, Dr. Bartlett. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
I am, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
I have the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 022, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Bartlett of Maryland.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading, and without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
This amendment, sir, is really a sense of the Congress that very simply reaffirms that the purpose of COMPETES is the intent by the Congress to implement the top 10 actions in priority order of the National Academy of Sciences 2005 report, Rising Above the Gathering Storm. This amendment states that these top 10 actions remain critical to maintaining long-term U.S. economic competitiveness and accordingly shall receive funding priority. As a reminder, the Gathering Storm report was very specific in its recommendations, focusing primarily in 2 areas of research and STEM education. 1, recommendation A, increase America's talent pool by vastly improving K through 12 science and mathematics education, and B, recommendation B, sustain and strengthen the nation's traditional commitment to long-term basic research that has the potential to be transformational, to maintain the flow of new ideas that fuel the economy, provide security, and enhance the quality of life. Most of the funding increases that we called for in the original COMPETES have not yet materialized. The sense of the Congress amendment supports efforts to redouble efforts to see COMPETES' original prioritized recommendations realized, and I thank you and yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Bartlett, for a good amendment. If there's no further discussion, those in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is passed. The next amendment on the roster is the amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia, Dr. Brown. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 023, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Brown of Georgia.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment would maintain consistency throughout many federal programs by prohibiting any funds authorized by this COMPETES authorization to be used for any lobbying activities to influence in any manner a member of Congress, a jurisdiction, or an official of any government. We do not want any recipient of appropriated funds by this reauthorization to use these funds in any way that is not consistent with the stated intent of any specified program. Failure to adopt this explicit lobbying prohibition could open up a Pandora's box of improper influence towards government officials with the very funds the government has appropriated to them. This amendment is simply a good government effort, and I urge the committee to support this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. I certainly agree with the intent of your motion and will support it. I want to put one caveat. Again, there may need to be some tweaking later on. I want to be sure that if Ms. Biggert were to go by the Argonne National Lab and ask for some advice or ask about this or that, that there wouldn't be a problem about them, responding to her. But certainly the spirit of where you're going is where we all want to be.
Mr. Chairman?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman.
Governor, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
following on what you just opened up the conversation, Mr. Chairman, some of this money is going to be used in a variety of ways, from grants to loans to loan guarantees to research going on at universities, hubs. I mean, it covers pretty much an encyclopedia of projects and research. It appears as though this language would prevent communication to us about what they are doing. If that's the case, this shouldn't be done. We should not pass this amendment. We need to know what they're up to. They need to be able to communicate to us what they're doing. We just went through the automobile issue here a moment ago. What are those research facilities doing? If they send us an annual report, that's an expenditure of money that could be deemed to be influencing us about the merits of that particular project. Now, with regard to federal employees and federal agencies, there are many laws already in place that prohibit the federal agencies from using their money to lobby us. I remember one of my colleagues getting in deep trouble in the 90s about that. So I'm wondering, I'm concerned about this. And the way it's written, lobbying and influencing and informing and da-da-da-da, I don't think we want to do this.
I think that this is somewhat standard. It's a standard concept in a variety of parts of legislation within the government. I think we just need to make sure that this is consistent with what's going on elsewhere and doesn't run into those problems that you mentioned in terms of, again, the advice we might want to get. Dr. Baird, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Two things. One, I very much associate myself with the remarks of Mr. Garmendi. If you, as many of my colleagues do as well, follow the business literature, in business, there's great concern about just top-down management, about a structure that says the guys on the bottom, so to speak, can see something happening, but they can't talk to the top. Well, it's one thing to lobby in the sense of self-interest. So I want you to give more money to me because I want more money for me. But it's quite another thing to lobby in the interest of the people that are public employees and others serve just as we serve. If you see a better way to do something, I think you ought to be able to tell members of Congress that without running afoul of and possibly facing criminal prosecution. So on the premise, I have a real problem with overly restrictive restriction on this. I mean, I think it really creates a bind on behalf of well-intentioned public employees who say, I actually think we can do this better, but I have no way legally of telling a member of Congress that without running risk of this. Now, the second point I would make is as Mr. Garmendi correctly pointed out, there are existing laws. 18 U.S.C. Section 1913 actually encompasses verbatim, as far as I can tell, the language of Mr. Brown's amendment up to a point. And then Mr. Brown's amendment leaves out certain language, and I will read the language that it leaves out, and the language it leaves out is substantive. So if you stop at Mr. Brown's amendment, the actual original statute reads, "But this shall not prevent officers or employees of the United States or its departments or agencies from communicating to any such member or official at his request, or to Congress or such official through the proper official channels, request for any legislation, law, ratification, policy, or appropriations which they deem necessary for the efficient conduct of the public business, or from making any communication whose prohibition by this section might, in the opinion of the Attorney General, violate the Constitution or interfere with the conduct of foreign policy, counterintelligence, intelligence, or national security activities, etc." Now, the question for me is, if we have that law in the books, why is that not included? And maybe it's just an oversight, but that protection of well-intentioned public officials speaking out in the best interest of the public ought to be in there. That's the existing generic law, and I'm puzzled as why it's not in Mr. Brown. I'd be happy to yield to Mr. Brown for an explanation if he can offer one.
Or maybe I could suggest, if you don't mind, Mr. Brown, why don't we defer this and let's try, as I say, I think no one would disagree with your intention, but I think there's some established language that you might be better off using that well-established language. So if you don't mind, this can be discussed a little bit longer, and we'll try to deal with it when we go to the floor.
Well, Mr. Chairman.
But I mean, if you have a differing opinion, that's perfectly fine.
Will you yield?
Certainly.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you yielding. The intent is, let me explain the intent. In Section 24, subsection B, duties of the Office of Innovation and Entrepreneurship, I'm reading from the bill, shall be responsible for, paragraph 1, it says, developing and advocating policies. In the amendment, there is a very clear definition put in place in this amendment, and I'll be glad to read it. You can look at it right there in the in subsection in section B, subsection B of Section 701, prohibiting lobbying in the amendment, that very clearly defines what we're trying to do. And it's, I would love to work with the chairman. I'd love to work with anyone else on the other side, because I think that your concerns about communication and things like that and suggestions of better ways to do things, certainly I'm in favor of those. But I think we have a clear-cut definition of lobbying. And, Mr. Chairman, if y'all would accept the amendment and let's pass it, then I'd be glad to work with the other side to do what we can.
Would the gentleman yield?
Certainly, Dr. Yu.
Mr. Brown, if I may, just cutting to the chase of the statutory language which Mr. Baird cited, the most important exemption there is that the prior statutory language of that other provision allows us as members of Congress to ask a question of executive branch officials and permits them to answer the question as asked. And that exemption is missing in your proposed amendment, and I think that is a very, very important exemption. When we ask questions, folks in the agencies, to the extent that they're permitted by their higher-ups, if you will, within the executive branch, ought to be able to answer those questions without fear of a statutory provision. I think that's very, very important. I'd be happy to yield back.
Well, thank you, sir. I appreciate it, Mr. Wu, and I agree. I want to ask questions, and we have to hold them accountable, and they should answer the question. And I'd be glad to add clarifying language as we proceed forwards. Hopefully, we'll accept this amendment and get the clarifying language in the final report.
Mr. Chairman, I would not be inclined to accept the language as is. I might be willing to accept it if we offered the remainder of the statute, 18 U.S.C. Section 1913, as a secondary amendment. Under that case, I would, but I think there are huge unintended consequences of the amendment as written, and I couldn't support it without a secondary amendment.
Mr. Grayson hadn't had a chance to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The First Amendment gives every American the right to petition the government to redress his grievances. Yes. And I'm concerned that this amendment to this bill, as written, denies Americans that right. I want to point out that in the language circulated by Dr. Baird, there's specific recognition of the fact that we can't restrict speech that would violate the Constitution, or we can't restrict speech in a manner that would violate the Constitution. I see nothing in the Brown Amendment that respects that very fundamental principle, and I am concerned that the Brown Amendment as written is unconstitutional. I yield the remainder of my time.
Diaz-Balart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, if I can address the root of my question to Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, I just want to make sure that I've been hearing the same thing everybody else has. You said that you're willing to make sure that your amendment is corrected through the process to make sure that all those issues are resolved with. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
All right, Mr. Chairman, with that, I mean, we do this all the time in this process. And you've been great at that, Mr. Chairman, where we'll have a discussion and you'll say we'll work with you and we'll accept the language and move forward. I think we have a colleague here who says, and we've heard today that everybody agrees with this concept, and he's willing to work with everybody to make sure that all of those issues are resolved. So I don't know what the big issue. If the sponsor of the amendment says he wants to resolve these issues, the chairman of the committee, who controls the committee, can sit down with him and work out those issues. I'm not quite sure what the big problem is here.
Well, control is
I yield back,
a
Mr.
term of art that I'm not sure that I would agree with. I think there's a couple of ways. Another way to approach this is that again, that in essence, this be made in abeyance and let both sides work together and then come forward with something. I think that's going to make folks over here more comfortable.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Dr. Brown.
I would be happy to accept a secondary amendment from Dr. Barrett if he wants to present one, or I'd rather do that and actually get some lobbying prohibition put in place. But I'd be glad to work with the chairman as well as others on the other side to try to straighten this out. I just I'd like to go forward with some lobbying prohibition. I certainly don't want to stop any dialogue between members or this committee or anybody with any part of the administration. So I'd be very happy to work this out. I'd like to see the amendment accepted, and then let's work out the language in the final product if possible. And I yield back.
Okay. All right. The problem we're going to have to get the secondary amendment, we're going to have to get it printed up, walk through, and so it's going to take us a while. So I think we're going to have to, with unanimous consent, move your amendment to the back of the amendments. See if they can come up with their printing. And if they can do it and comfortably, we'll go forward. If they can't, then we'll just either you can have a vote on yours, or we'll hold it and wait and try to work something out later.
Mr. Chairman, if I have your assurance, because I have utmost respect and confidence in your word, if you will assure me that we can work out this language and get it in the final product, I'll withdraw and defer to you if I can have that assurance from you, sir.
I think Ms. Edwards wants to be recognized.
Ms. Edwards is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Because I actually really do have some concern, and we've talked a lot in this committee about consistency. And I worry when you take part of a provision like this, well-intentioned, I think, Mr. Brown, don't take all of it that's already where there are already criminal sanctions available, and then single this out for a specific lobbying prohibition. Does that mean that every time we want to prohibit lobbying with appropriated funds, rather than going back to the code where there is an overall prohibition, that we would have to create that? Because I actually think that that in itself creates a legal problem. So in one part of the code, in one section, you would have a prohibition, but then in another, a not. And the fact is that there is an underlying prohibition on using appropriated funds to lobby. And before coming into Congress, I spent a fair amount of time, about 10 years, working on lobbying prohibitions. So and I think the idea behind putting lobbying prohibitions across the board when using appropriated funds is specifically so that we don't have to come in every single committee and every single piece of legislation and worry about whether we have interfered with that prohibition. And so I don't actually, I think we could use some advice from counsel, because I'm actually not certain that this provision, frankly, is even necessary given the state of the law as it is. And I'd like some clarification to that before I would go forward. And I'd yield just briefly, Mr. Rayburn.
So your position is that this is already illegal across the board to use government grants to lobby us. So that's your position, which seems to be in contrast to your colleague's position that such a restriction is unconstitutional in some way. I guess that type of inconsistency on that side of the aisle is what maybe
well, if
Dr.
the gentleman
Brown is
would,
trying to clarify.
I'd like to reclaim my time. There's no inconsistency at all, because the lobbying prohibition that exists has an exclusion for the constitutional issues that have been raised. And so there is no inconsistency. Where the inconsistency would be is if the gentleman, if we in this committee pass a lobbying prohibition, we don't do it anyplace else, And then it raises into question whether that underlying provision prevails or whether this one would, even when it has the same or similar language. And so I'd beg for this committee to exercise a little judgment of consistency and conformity and understanding. And speaking as somebody who's raised a lot of federal money and worked with it and had to sign off on those prohibitions, I know that people are clear, and when they're not clear, they face criminal prosecution, as is contained in the code already. And so I believe that those lobbying restrictions with the appropriate constitutional exceptions are already in law, and I don't see any reason for this committee to replicate that.
Would the lady yield?
I'll yield, Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. We are putting in place in this bill, the Office of Innovation and Entrepreneurship. We're charging it directly with the responsibility of advocating policies. There, as the gentlelady just so ably articulated, it's against the law to lobby, but we're charging this office to lobby if we don't clarify that. And that's the reason that we have a necessity of this. This is to maintain consistency. I want to work this out so that we do maintain consistency, but we are charging in this bill for this Office of Innovation and Entrepreneurship to advocate policies, and I'm just very, very concerned about that, because
let me reclaim my time, because the plain English definition of advocacy is not, in fact, the same thing as lobbying. And the law that is in place would apply to the use of any appropriated funds for lobbying as already defined, with criminal sanctions that are available. And so I don't see the necessity to it. And I think if we were doing anything, we'd simply refer back to the underlying law that already has criminal sanctions and includes the constitutional exceptions. And with that, I yield my time.
Would you then let the gentlelady yield back?
I suspect that Mr. English would like to yield you some time, Dr. Brown.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I was thinking of doing that. I'd be happy to yield to the gentleman from Georgia.
I thank the chairman. I thank my colleague from South Carolina. I'd like to ask Ms. Edwards to define advocacy so that we can have it plain and clear. I just want to be sure that we don't have this federal entity charged with lobbying, and I want some consistency throughout the government. And what we seem to be doing, and my concern is that we're charging this federal agency, the Office of Innovation and Entrepreneurship, to do what is blatantly untenable under federal law. So the whole intent of this, and what I've offered to do, is to try to clarify the language with my colleagues on the other side, and I'm eager to do so. I'm very well aware of the First Amendment and what it says, and I'm very well aware that we need to have the ability to ask people in the administration questions about what they're doing, and we need to hold them accountable. And I'm eager to try to work this out so that the way the bill is written right now today, and it appears to me, just through the plain common sense language, and I'm a common sense language person, the bill charges the Office of Innovation and Entrepreneurship in advocating policies, which is lobbying. And if there's a difference between lobbying and advocating policies, I'd like to know it, and I'd like to just work this out so that, and I'm eager to do so, very eager to do so that we can all be satisfied. And if we can do that, I'd like to proceed forwards, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
May I inquire at this point? I know the gentleman yielded back, but perhaps he would like to unyield his yielding, and so that I could ask him a brief question. Gentleman.
I've already yielded back.
Well, let me make this suggestion. I think we're all seeing the same. I hate to use the word wreck, but the same incident, but we're seeing it a little bit differently. I think a lot of this is definitions, and so this really, is somewhat first experience in terms of going through this for many of us right here. I just don't see how we can come to a conclusion today. Again, I would hope that that the two of you, that all of us would work together for common language. I cannot guarantee you, I can only guarantee you there'll be an effort to work together. And that's, so that's where we are. And I think we either need to vote or, move on, because I think we got to sit down and really talk about this and look at more what the precedents are.
Will the chairman yield for brief comment?
Yes, certainly, Mr. Royson.
Thank you. I just want to suggest that we might be able to resolve this by substituting a different amendment that says, where the bill refers to advocacy, simply adding the words, "but not lobbying." If we had an amendment that said advocacy and then added the words, "but not lobbying," I think that would address the concerns that have been stressed by certain people on this side of the aisle.
Governor.
Mr. Chairman, I think a question to council might help us here. Are there in the federal codes laws that define and restrict lobbying activity with the use of federal money?
We're not aware of all possible references, but we do know that 18 U.S.C. Section 1913 includes a blanket prohibition on the use of any money appropriated by any enactment of Congress to be used directly or indirectly for these sorts of things we're talking about.
Well, so at least in one code section, this issue is already handled, unless we provide explicit authorization. Otherwise, that code section would apply. Is that the case?
It applies to any enactment of Congress.
Okay. I think this may have already been covered, and perhaps a way of dealing with this without having to really get into what is I believe to be a judiciary matter, a judiciary committee matter, that it might be applicable, might be useful simply to reference existing codes. And that's a question to council. Could this be dealt with that way? Or it may not even be necessary to do anything.
It could be. And
I guess the question, it can be done that way, whether it can be done, whether we have to get a new amendment or just what the process is. But Dr. Ehlers is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just observe, you've been the chairman for some time, and I've always admired the way you've resolved these difficulties, simply by asking the parties to get together before the next meeting or before it appears on the floor or whatever, and resolve the problem. And it's worked very well every time. You're very fair in bringing people together and dealing with the issues and bringing out the facts. And I think what we're trying to do, or have been trying to do here for the last 45 minutes, is write new law with 30 people with different memories and different opinions. So my suggestion is that you just do it the way you've normally done it, which has worked very well, and just ask that we defer this and you point this group of people to resolve it and bring it back to us, whether it's in this committee or whether it's through a floor amendment, the Rules Committee, or whatever matter. But you've done that so well in the past. I think we've wasted a lot of time here on something that you normally resolve very quickly, and I urge you to
Would the gentleman yield?
that. Yes, I'll be happy to yield.
I thank the gentleman's comment. The chairman and I have been trying to do this for 10 minutes now, and I have utmost respect for the chairman. We have done this very amicably in the past, and I assume that we could do so. And if we could just reference the 18 code to make sure that we do this, I'm fine with that. And I suggest that I withdraw the amendment, that we work this out. And I've already gotten the chairman's assurances that we'll try to work this out. And I repeat, try to work this out. And I believe in my heart that we can, with my concerns and the concerns on your side. So thus, I will withdraw the amendment. We'll move forward.
Thank you, Dr. Brown, and let's don't mess it up.
Mr.
Let's take it and go.
Mr. Chairman, if I just may, I think this is important. Just leaning back to what Ms. Edwards said, I think that as we work this out, that it's important that if we're going to refer to this particular U.S. code, that we refer to every U.S. code that deals with discrimination, employee rights, safe working environments. Because if we're going to do this, I just hope that that's taken into consideration, Mr. Chairman.
I think as we go from here to the floor, we'll try to take everything in consideration and have a fair resolution. The amendment is withdrawn. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hall. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment? The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 022, time-stamped April 26, 2010, 5:26 p.m. Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Hall of Texas.
Okay, I use unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. Recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, the bill before us today, in one way or the other, creates, expands, or modifies a variety of grant programs of NSF, DOE, and NIST for the institutions of higher education. My amendment accomplishes simply one thing, just one thing. It adds a section at the end of the bill which, for all, quote, activities and programs supported by this act and amendments made by this act, gives institutions of higher education that serve students with disabilities like Gallaudet University here in Washington, or those serving disabled veterans like Mount Wachusett Community College in Massachusetts, the same special consideration given to other institutions that serve populations underrepresented in STEM, so that they too can benefit from those programs and contribute to their competitiveness. This language is very similar to a provision already in the NSF title of the bill. The only difference is that I'm applying it to all of the titles of the bill and also adding those schools that serve disabled veterans. We're adding those schools that serve disabled veterans to the list. I know all of us appreciate the tremendous sacrifices our veterans make for our nation. I hope my colleagues will join me in support of this amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. The chairman recognizes himself. We certainly, share the spirit of this and the recommendation that was made by the committee that recommends for outreach for minorities, women, and disability, made the specific recommendation of those chartered schools. The concern that I have here is that this is such an expansion that it covers everywhere where it makes nobody special in this regard. If they're serving disabled veterans, that could very well mean that if they are in compliance with ADA and you have a veteran there, which virtually every university will have, then you're opening it up to say every university is treated this way, which really is reduces the benefits to Gallaudet and to those other schools. So I think your intention is good, but I'm afraid that the expanse is too large.
I don't know if the expense. I'm not sure its expense can be too large for disabled veterans. There's 3.1 million vets receiving disability compensation. Only around 280,000 of them are rated as 100% disabled. I'm willing to relegate it some way to where it doesn't open the.
Well, I think, Mr. Hall, the distinction, this is not for the disabled veteran, it's for the institution. And so I think you have another amendment that provides a priority for veterans in terms of scholarships.
Right.
And we would certainly agree with that. This is not aimed at giving the disabled veteran a benefit. It is the institution that the disabled veteran might attend,
They may
and
be,
that's going to be in all the institutions.
they may be paid for it, but the disabled veteran would be the recipient of the treatment. It would open, if that opens the floodgates, maybe we ought to open the floodgates.
Mr. Chairman, the reading, apparently it says, institutions of higher education chartered to serve large numbers of students with disabilities. And there is a quantification there that does differentiate one institution from another. Maybe it needs to be more defined, but that's some language.
I think those are two different sections there, and again, it's how you might interpret it. But again, it goes to the institution, not the student or the veteran.
That's exactly true, but the veteran receives the educational treatment that gives them a better opportunity to have a normal life.
Well, not necessarily, because it's whatever that institution may be getting, the veteran might not be interested in.
Well, you know, a little Boy Scout helped a woman across the street and she didn't want to go. It might be the situation anywhere, but I think by and large the situation would be that the veteran would be benefited from it. He'd benefit from it by upping his skills at the educational market, have a better opportunity to come back, return to society, however disabled they were. If you're disabled, you're disabled.
Well, that's why we would be supporting the next amendment that talks about the veteran specifically. As a practical matter, this is going to make every institution available, so it's really no benefit to anyone.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Dr. Baird.
With this language, let me give an example and see if this language suggestion will help, and it may be already in there and I may be just reading it wrong. So not far from here, we've got Gallaudet. There are institutions for the blind, and there are others. Some subset of our veterans, and then there are institutions that have particularly helped people with paralysis and lost limbs, et cetera. Some subset of our veterans may attend an institution like Gallaudet, maybe they lost their hearing. If we were to say veterans within institutions, along the lines of what Mr. Rohrbacher was saying, that are specifically chartered to serve a large number of people with disabilities. So you're then, the veterans who fit that category benefit from being in such institution. I think the chairman's point is, insofar as every college and university in America ought to be serving veterans with disabilities, by opening it up to every college and institution, we're not targeting anybody. I think that's your point, Mr. Chairman. And so Mr. Hall's point, those veterans with disabilities who are attending institutions chartered specifically to serve large numbers of people with disabilities would benefit from this. So could we add or modify the language in that fashion?
We could take some modified language, and I'd recommend some modified language to you, and would continue to work with you on it. We could say, well, of course, we refer to the populations underrepresented in STEM so that they too can benefit. Disabled veterans are certainly an underrepresented population, and I think they certainly come under this. And if there's some way to relegate it population-wise to each institution, I wouldn't be adverse to that. And we could put this ad there where it says, and those with programs serving disabled veterans or those who have large numbers of veterans shall receive special consideration.
The problem is large number is sort of unspecific, and to serve to disabled, if every school is going to abide by the ADA, and if they're abiding the ADA, then by definition they're serving the veterans. So they're serving everybody.
Well, we're talking about yellow ribbon schools as determined by the Department of Veterans Affairs, potentially, but I think there's a way to do this, and perhaps we've tried to work something out here and been unable to. I'm not anxious to make anybody vote against veterans or disabled veterans. None of us want to do that, but we don't want to flood the market unnecessarily. But it's hard for me to feel that if a disabled veteran can benefit themselves from the education they receive, though the school receives the money, that makes a lot of sense to me. I don't, maybe I'm not opposed to flooding the market with those if there's that many out there that seek that type of education. I don't think there would be.
Again, it's not the individual, it's going to be the school, and every school is going to be eligible. So,
but they have to have a warm body.
well, there may be a school that doesn't have a veteran somewhere, or a disabled veteran, but there won't be many.
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Yes, Dr. Bear.
I share, and I think we all share, Mr. Hall's desire to try to help out disabled veterans. And Mr. Hall, you know, if there's a way, and I think that's what you're grasping at, and saying if there's a way to target the help for the veterans rather than speak to the institution where the veteran happens to go to school, because so many veterans are going to so many schools that the school benefits, but the veteran themselves may not. In an analogous, and it's not a perfect analogy, but an analogous to how Ms. Bernice Johnson, she was able to target institutions because there are specific institutions chartered with specific missions. It's harder to do it in the case of veterans, but maybe there's a way we could, you know, revisit the intent of this, draft some different amendments so that, for example, let me give you an example. Let's suppose a chemistry department wants to participate in an effort in a hub, let's say, and that chemistry department makes a particular element of its application that we are working with veterans. Then they're there, but not just because a veteran happens to attend the school. And I don't know how to do that. I'm sure we cannot do that in the time here, but that seems to be what we're shooting for here. And I don't know how to get there, but that seems to be what we're trying to get at.
If we can't do that in the time here, and we've tried and apparently been unable to work out language that's agreeable to both sides, we can either vote an up or down vote on the bill the way it is, or we can have some type. The chairman's fair. I don't say anybody here is unfair, and no one wants to be unfair with the disabled veteran, nor the schools that educate them, nor the schools that benefit some by upgrading a potential disabled veteran's chances in the workaday world. Maybe we can work something out that protects it from. We have situations here. All sample of schools with disabled veterans programs. The University of Idaho has Operation Education, they call it, Arkansas State University, Pride Center for America's Wounded Veterans, University of Kansas Wounded Warrior Education Initiative Program. They've got programs for veterans all over. Michigan State, MSU Disabled Veterans Assistance Program.
Mr. Hall?
No, there's, yes, sir.
What if we take that principle you're working on here and said something like, wordsmithing here a little bit, but priority shall be given to institutions who have demonstrated programs dedicated to increasing the involvement of disabled veterans in the STEM fields. So in other words, the mere attendance at your institution doesn't qualify, but if your institution has gone out of its way and created a program to help disabled veterans participate in STEM education, then you get some priority. And maybe your language does that already, but I think that's what you're driving at.
Ms. Edwards is recognized.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Hall. And I have to tell you, as the daughter of a disabled veteran, I always want to try to figure out with you what we can do for our disabled veterans. And I want to get to what the underlying, I think, issue is with the institutions that are chartered. And we have a number of disabled veterans, particularly coming back now from Iraq and Afghanistan, who have specific kinds of disabilities. They may have lost sight, they may have lost hearing, they may have TBI, traumatic brain injuries that result in attention deficit problems. And the institutions that are chartered are actually serving those particular populations. And so I think if we could work on some language that encourage those institutions that we want to receive sort of priority or receive research funding to also include the service that they're giving to our veterans for those particular disabilities, then that would be really good, because what's happening is that when veterans return with very specialized disabilities, sometimes the majority institutions aren't really at a capacity where they can serve them. And these institutions that are chartered to serve those specific disability communities would be in a much better position to do that, and with the research partnerships than, you know, even some majority institution where a person with a traumatic brain injury that may have attention deficit is just one in a, you know, a number of the population. So I'd like to see if we can work on some language that actually enabled the chartered institutions that are providing those specific sort of disability, serving those disability communities to be able to qualify based on also their service to our disabled veterans community. And if you'd agree, I'd love to be able to work with you on the language that would get to those chartered institutions.
Thank you for your efforts and for your suggestion. I suggest that we voice vote this with the understanding that we work on this to find language that that's agreeable to the chairman and agreeable to those who advise the chairman. I don't know how much time we'd have to do that or when this will come to the floor, but if we could work on this till that time, I'd be willing to do that. Once again, I don't believe there's anybody on here that wants to vote against a disabled veteran under any circumstances, no matter what the consequences are. I don't want to put you in that position. I don't want to be put in that position. But there must be some way we could work this out that wouldn't flood the gates of any university. But I don't know why a university wouldn't want these. They're paid, well paid.
Mr. Hall, if you would yield for just one moment. If you look in Section 244, the section institutions serving persons with disabilities, after it says that the institutions of higher learning chartered to serve large numbers with disabilities, you could add in there, including disabled veterans, including at the Gallaudet University, Landmark College, and the National Institute for the Deaf, so that you actually get the veterans populations in those chartered institutions.
Mr. Chairman?
The only problem with that, they're disabled vets that aren't blind or deaf. What do you do with them?
Well, some of the the chartered institutions serve the blind, they serve the deaf, and if you go to Landmark College, because I had to do some studying up on Landmark College, and the population that it serves is a wide range of disability communities across, you know, quite a swath of disability communities, and not just targeted to the deaf or the blind.
Mr. Robacher, do you want to be recognized?
Mr. Chairman, let's just note that what this is all about. Mr. Hall, who is one of our most distinguished veterans in this body, a veteran from World War II, has over the years championed the cause of veterans, especially disabled veterans. And now he's trying to add that category onto a list in this legislation that includes a list that says predominantly black institutions, tribal college and universities, Native Americans serving non-tribal institutions, Asian American, Native and American Pacific Islanders, an Alaska Native Service Institution, Native Hawaiian serving institutions, Hispanic serving institutions. Now you tell me that all these other colleges don't serve Native Americans, they don't serve Hispanics, they don't serve blacks, and that thus, but that's why they have to be designated here, but disabled American veterans don't deserve any of that consideration as all those other groups. Now this is—
Would the gentleman yield?
Well, let me finish my point first. Look, obviously we want all Americans to benefit from any legislation that we passed. We've already gone through, so we've come to the point where we're naming these groups, naming institutions that are designed specifically for those groups, although we realize all colleges and universities have to serve all Americans. Otherwise, it's discrimination and it's against the law. But when that didn't deter us from putting these names on the list. And I would suggest that our ranking member is doing a wonderful job for a group of people here, and that we should not, he should not be getting this type of resistance.
We're trying to give,
What's going on.
would the gentleman yield?
And I certainly would, yes.
I thank the gentleman. I want to be really clear. I spent a great deal of my time helping disabled veterans. I've got a doctorate in psychology. I work with brain-injured veterans. I'm passionate about this. I spent a lot of my life on it. Ms. Edwards talked about her own fathers. We're trying to help here.
Well, look,
the point here, but let me explain,
okay.
if I may. It's your time, but our concern is precisely Mr. Hall wants to help disabled veterans. We all agree with that, and he's acknowledged that. Our concern is the way the bill is written, it's so broad that the veterans themselves may not benefit. We're trying to say, let's write it in such a way so that the veterans benefit and not just any institution that happens to have a veteran at it.
Okay, well, reclaiming my time. For example, they define Hispanic serving institution. If only 25% of the student body is Hispanic, it becomes an Hispanic serving institution. You know, if we're talking about, you know, thresholds here, let's talk about thresholds, but the fact is, this is a principle that we're trying to get at, and I don't think it's going to cause the dislocation that this resistance to Mr. Hall's amendment seems to be bringing forward.
If I may.
Just, you're only talking about special consideration here. That's all we're talking about. And I think these disabled veterans, maybe all veterans, but especially those people who are disabled, deserve special consideration.
With the gentleman, nobody on our side has said a word about worrying about whether funding is going to be dislocated from somewhere else. We're actually quite the contrary. We're not resisting this because we're not resisting it. Let me start there. There's no resistance from our side, zero, to this to the intent of this amendment, zero that I'm hearing. What we're trying to say is let's write it in such a way that it actually helps the targeted population. And I want to be, I hope my friend is not trying to set up a situation. I don't think he is, because you're a good friend. I don't think you're trying to imply that, oh, gee, those Democrats were eager to help all sorts of minorities, but when it came to veterans, they dug in their heels. Quite the contrary. What we're trying to do is say, if you want to help veterans, let's write language that definitely helps the veterans, not the broad institution that a veteran may happen to attend, but the veteran gets none of the benefit.
Okay, reclaiming my point, just so you know, I do not automatically think that every time we come up with something or you come up with something that sounds like it would resonate in the public, that it's politically motivated. And when we're, as I say, there's no, I don't know anybody else who's more respected in this Congress for the service that he's given our country than Ralph Hall. And he's trying to do something good here, and it just seems to me that we went all these other situations where we really, yeah, sure, okay, a native servicing institution, fine. We didn't worry about the defining it in a way, even though that Natives Americans go to lots of institutions. And anyway.
It's because I respect.
If the gentleman would yield, I guess,
yes.
I think what we're trying to stop is this. We're trying to stop what you might call an unethical school, or a school that wants to parade out or recruit one disabled veteran in a 50,000 school to try to get some kind of a preference. What we'd like to get to is a school that provides some type of special training for a large number of veterans. So we're trying to get it to the veteran, not to the school.
Mr. Chairman, just about every legislation that we pass, if you try to find a provision, you can carry it out to where somebody can manipulate it. Almost every piece of legislation we pass, there's a way for someone who doesn't want to go with the spirit of it to take advantage of it. And the spirit of what Ralph Hall's trying to do here is clear. And it's just as clear as those servicing Hispanic institutions which are in here. And I'm not opposed to that. But anyway, we can make that argument just about anything that we bring up, that there's somebody who can actually manipulate it in a way that it wasn't intended.
Mr. Chairman, it is because of my profound respect for Mr. Hall that I'm trying to be helpful here. And I think that's the case with my colleagues. We are sincerely trying to make sure the money goes. I've been in institutions. I taught there. I want and Mr. Hall gave a great list of deserving institutions that have created specific programs to help veterans get into STEM. So that's why I said let's let's make the language, not just that you serve a veteran, because serving a veteran means you give somebody a class. They get a GI Bill, they come in, you give them a class, but the hell with them. You don't care about them. That's not going to help the individual. It may help the institution. They say, oh, look, we got a veteran here, give us money. What Mr. Hall wants to say is make sure the veterans get into the STEM opportunities 100% right. And it's because I respect him that I agree with his intent, don't disagree with it at all. I just think the language as written is overly broad, and if we can focus it, it'll actually do what he wants in a better way. So this is because we respect Mr. Hall and our veterans that we're trying to help. We're not, I actually concur with Mr. Hall. I think we ought to voice vote it, pass it, and then work with him to try to improve it and make sure it gets to the people he wants to get it. So I actually agree with that.
And I say that that's agreeable. I don't disagree with that. And I respect the gentleman and everyone here. I respect the chairman enough to believe that we will be able to ride around it to where it would be acceptable and not detrimental to the universities nor detrimental to the veterans. And if we voice vote it, and if that voice vote is aye, then I'll feel a lot better toward the opportunity of working it out. But
I think Mr. Grayson would like the last word, and then we will go to a voice vote.
Rather than talking about this in the abstract, I'm looking at the language, and I just would like to get a sense from Mr. Hall about how it might apply to specific instances. That will give me some idea of exactly what we might be buying into through a voice vote. This provision says that there are 3 classes of institutions that get special consideration. One is institutions chartered to serve large numbers of students with disabilities. The second one is institutions with programs serving disabled veterans. And the third one is institutions that serve disabled veterans. I just want to get a general sense of how you think that should work in practice, and I honestly, listening to the debate, don't have that yet. So if Mr. Hall would be so kind, we'll just pick an example. Let's say a large, undifferentiated institution, not specifically targeted toward veterans, like, let's say, the University of Southern California. Can Mr. Hall please tell me if he contemplates that an institution like USC would be one that is chartered to serve large numbers of students with disabilities?
they may not have a described program, but they probably would have a lot of such veterans there and in need in that territory, in that area. I would even listen to limiting it to 10% of the student body of the institution that they apply to.
Well, I think a numerical limit would be...
Work this out, I think, if we had time to work it out. And I'd feel good if we voice voted this and then agree to work it out.
All right, reclaiming my time just to work this through and get a sense of what you have in mind, and I do think a numerical limit would be extremely helpful here. Again, returning to a specific example, let's say USC again, would Mr. Hall contemplate that USC be an institution with programs serving disabled veterans and therefore qualifying for the special consideration under this amendment?
So do they need to have special programs to qualify?
Yes.
All right, and would USC also be an institution serving disabled veterans and therefore qualifying for a special consideration?
I would consider that.
All right, it sounds to me that reclaiming my time, it sounds to me that the chairman's point actually is well taken, and that if USC qualifies under this provision, essentially every college or university in the country might, and therefore I am concerned that this provision is overbroad. I do understand what I think Mr. Hall is trying to accomplish here, and as Dr. Baird has said, I agree with it. But I do have the chairman's concern that this language includes essentially, potentially, every college and university in the country without any limitation. And I'm sorry to reach that conclusion, but based upon what I've heard, that is my conclusion. I yield the rest of my time.
Okay, if there's no further discussion, the vote is on Mr. Hall's amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Nay. The ayes have it, and we will continue to work on the attention that everyone wants, and that is to help those disabled veterans.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the gentlemen who have made the suggestions. and we will remain willing to work something out that's reasonable. And
You were the one that made the suggestion.
we do that. Thank you.
The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hall. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment? Well, he will be soon.
I do have an amendment.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 024, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Hall of Texas.
Mr. Chairman.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with reading. And without further objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment could be considered as a companion to my previously offered amendment, the previously passed amendment, and also affects the whole bill. The last amendment partially deals with institutions of higher education with programs for disabled veterans. This amendment speaks specifically to scholarship and fellowship programs offered in this act. It simply states that when awarding scholarships and fellowships, a school, quote, shall give preference to veterans and service members, unquote, including those serving in Iraq and Afghanistan. Many of these young men and women return home and either begin or continue their college education, oftentimes after receiving quite a bit of on-the-job training in a variety of STEM fields. This positions them well for opportunities offered under this act, and they deserve preference if they're submitting quality applications. I hope my colleagues will join me in supporting this amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Hall, and I think this is a good targeted amendment to the veterans themselves. Is there further discussion? Ms. Edwards.
Mr. Hall, just to be really clear, I think this is a great amendment. Look forward to supporting it, and I thank you for your service.
And just to be perfectly clear, I think you're a wonderful member of this.
So we're all clear, and with no further discussion, the vote is on Mr. Hall's amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The next amendment, no, you can't. You have to be for it. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Neugenbarger. You know, I just mess it up every time, don't I? Okay. My friend from Texas, are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 069, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Nagelbauer of Texas.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. To recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Well, I'm thinking about just yielding my time to the ranking member because he's on a roll here. But, Mr. Chairman, thank you. You know, we started this discussion off earlier today, and it has been a long day. But I think we have to understand that we are dealing with, you know, some unprecedented times, in our budget, in our deficits. We're talking about a deficit that this year could be 1.3 to 1.7 trillion dollars, and that's a lot of money. In fact, if you have to count to $1 trillion, it takes you 29,000 years. We started counting with 1, 2, 3. As I traveled across my district, and I know members go back to their district and just came off of a recent recess speaking to groups, you know, one of the questions I've been asking the people that I represent, you know, to raise their hand, how many people in this room, you know, are living a better life than their parents? And almost every hand goes up in that room. And then I ask them how many people in the room believe that their children and grandchildren will live a better life than they will if we continue down the road here of spending money that we don't have and charging it to our children and grandchildren. And you know what's sad is very few, if any, hands go up. So this is something that's not just the rhetoric that should be spoken here in Washington, D.C., but this is what the American people all across this country are thinking about. And they're looking to us, the people that they've elected, to manage the affairs of this country, to do something about it. And so my amendment is very clear. And until the CBO director can certify that we do not have a deficit, that the spending levels under this bill would be frozen at the 2010 authorized amount. And basically that's the same budget, that's the same principle that the American people live off of, you know. If they have more money, they're able to spend more money. If they don't have more money, they're not able to spend more money. And I think the American people are looking to the federal government to be able to handle their affairs just like handle their affairs up here like they're handling them back home. And so, Mr. Chairman, I think this is a common sense budget. I think all of us are committed to, making sure that we move some of these programs forward. Maybe we're not able to afford to expand them at the rate that this bill does until such time as we do demonstrate that we are handling the affairs of the American people in a more appropriate way, and the economy turns around, and those jobs that we've been promised to actually finally show up, and people get back to work, and the economy starts growing again, and tax revenues go up, and maybe we get our pencils out and we sharpen them, and we figure out ways to prioritize how we spend the American people's money, and maybe we have to cut some programs, and maybe we increase some programs. But what we do know is the direction we're going right now is for the continuation of massive deficits, almost doubling the national debt in 5 years, tripling it in 10 years, and that's not sustainable. The Federal Reserve Chairman Bernanke recently said that. A number of the President's cabinet members have said that these are not sustainable levels. And so the question is, well, when do you start doing something about that? And we can't say, well, this committee's not going to do it until another committee's going to do it. I think we have to, in every committee that we sit on, be prudent about how we represent the American people's money and their affairs. And I think a good start here is today is to say yes to this amendment because it makes sense. Doesn't gut the funding of the program, just says it's going to be flat until we get back on our feet. With that, I yield back my time.
Thank you. And let me, I think you really exhibited many of our concerns about the deficit. But let me put this in context. You talk about a family have to live within their means. Well, we are moving forward, and the President is moving forward with a budget that is within the discretionary spending is flat. And so it's a matter of making priorities. And so there are other areas that are going to go down in an effort so that we can have priorities for investment that will pay off. And so this is within the context of that flat budget. It's just that many of us feel that this is an investment that will pay off. I saw that recently. You can see it with Intel, with Microsoft. As they've gone through their tough times, they invested in the R&D, and they've come out better for it at the end. So I certainly agree with you. We need to live within a budget, but we need to have priorities within that budget. And I yield back to the gentleman from Texas.
And I appreciate the chairman saying that. I think one of the things we do have to understand is the President submitted a budget, but this body has not passed a budget, and it's being represented by the leadership of the majority that you may not present a budget to us. And so I don't know how we can actually go down that pathway of prioritization if we don't actually go down that pathway of prioritization and actually bring a budget before the House of Representatives so that we can have that debate and discussion. And we've not had that. And so I appreciate what you're saying, and I'd love to have that debate and discussion, but since we don't have that blueprint in front of us, I think this is a direction that at least says, we're going to hold the line here. Hopefully that catches on to some other committees, and they say, we're going to hold the line here, and you know what, pretty soon we may, actually start reducing our deficit. Now yield the gentleman's time back.
Well, I hope some of them will go under the line, and that we'll see some that are actually cut so that we can have a priorities. I'll just remind everyone that you can't cash an authorization. This is not an appropriation. This is an effort by our committee to try to demonstrate where we think there should be priorities. So is there anyone else that wishes to speak?
Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Brown, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I congratulate my friend, Mr. Nagelbauer. I hope I got that right. I think I did. For submitting this amendment. I wish I had thought of it, or I would have had 4 instead of 3. But I want to associate myself with what he said, and I think this is a very good, common sense, fiscally responsible amendment. And having no illusions, we're not going to pass this, and I don't think Mr. Nagelbauer thinks we go pass it either, but it's one that does make sense. And, Mr. Chairman, I wish we could control the appropriators with this committee and with this legislation. They seem to have a mind of their own and do whatever they want to, whether it's authorized or not. But we have one committee. We can't affect other committees. We can't affect appropriators. And what we are doing, if we were to pass this amendment, we would be telling the appropriators that we're just going to hold the line until we get out of this budget deficit that's unsustainable and untenable for the future of our nation. So I do support the amendment. Congratulate Mr. Nagelbauer for introducing it. I think it is one that makes sense just from a fiscally responsible perspective. And it's something that, unfortunately, this committee is going to not do. And I don't think our appropriators are going to do the right thing either. I think we're going to see continuation of deficits and debt created by this administration and by the leadership here in Congress. We have one opportunity to hold the line with this committee, and this is an opportunity to do it. My previous amendment was an opportunity to do it. I wish my colleagues would join us in trying to be responsible to the taxpayers of this nation, would join us in trying to be responsible to our children, our grandchildren, and the economic future of this nation, because we're not being responsible. We're being very irresponsible, unresponsible, and this amendment is to try to hold the line and make us responsible as a government. I yield back.
Mr. Davis is recognized.
Thank you for the opportunity to make a few comments. And before I get into my comments, I would like to say it's been a pleasure and privilege serving on this committee with you. And we have a chairman that kind of gets it, kind of figured it out, and has an awareness in him and a soul within him that realizes without research and spending dollars in targeted areas, our nation will not be in the future what it has been in the past. But I want to talk a little bit about debt. As a kid growing up, I read a story about Rip Van Winkle. Went to sleep for a long time. Some of the folks in this Congress and some of the advocates of holding the line on spending must have gone to sleep about 1981. Because in 1981, we owed less than $1 trillion. It was when Ronald Reagan elected president, was sworn on January the 20th. On the 1st of January, it was $933 billion, not a trillion, but $933 billion. And there was a lot of folks, not in this room necessarily, but a lot that are advocating as they are doing now, that must have gone to sleep. Because for the next 12 years, through the first Bush administration, we grew that debt to $4.1 trillion, over $3 billion in less than 12 years. And what did we buy with it? Not a single infrastructure did we invest in. But what was that $1 trillion for? For 4 wars, 1, 2, Vietnam, and Korea. An interstate system in this nation that gave us an opportunity to have the cutting edge, being on the cutting edge of economic development that made us the strongest, most powerful nation in the world economically and military-wise. We built every lake in this country that we have today before 1981. We built the Panama Canal and gave it back to them in '79, sent people to the moon and brought them back, built the shuttles that we have today, infrastructure that we spent on, and less than $1 trillion we had spent. And over 12 years, we spent another $3.2 trillion, increasing almost 4. Where were you then? Where were you then? Where I grew up, they say pigs get fed and hogs get slaughtered. Well, it looks like the pig of the debt got fed quite well for about 12 years and became a fat hog. But we didn't slaughter it. We still let it grow. And through the Clinton administration, with the Republicans in control of the House and Senate, we started reducing our debts and deficits. 4 years, we had a balanced budget. We grew by about $1.6 trillion during the Clinton administration, and we downsized government. Cutting taxes doesn't downsize government. Cutting spending downsizes government. And so when you cut taxes and let the debts continue to increase, you absolutely are cutting the throats of the future generations. We watched that happen. And then someone must have been asleep in 2001 when they let pay-go expire. Because when that expired, what happened? We doubled our national debt. I imagine Rip Van Winkle had some nightmares during the 8 years of the Bush administration. Because as we watched those debts just continue to grow and explode, doubled in 8 years. So my friends on both sides of the aisle, let's stop pointing fingers. It's okay to talk about facts, and what I've given you are facts. Look them up.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'm not through.
Oh, okay.
You'll have your 5 minutes in a minute. What happened? We cut taxes and we didn't cut government. The American public was convinced that cutting taxes cuts government. That is not the case. I'm for cutting taxes and don't like to increase them. We passed a prescription drug bill in 2003 and didn't pay for it. We are now, and our children will. I didn't vote for the health care bill that just passed, but it's paid for. It's not going to add to deficits. According to the CBO, you may have other figures otherwise. It's time we start paying. You're right for what we've been doing. But shame on you for implying that all this just happened the last year and a half. The $12 trillion we owe has collected over the last 30 years, of which 6 years of those, from 81 to 87, was controlled by a Republican Senate. And starting in 1995 through 2007, by a Republican House and Senate, and part of that was by a Republican president. Maybe I'm making political statements now. Let it be if that's the case. But honesty is something that needs to prevail inside this chamber, inside this committee, and as we continue to debate what's going on in this nation, we do need to get a handle on it. And the move that was made just recently, about a month and a half ago, where we passed pay-as-you-go that said, even if the Republicans get control of this Congress, they'll have to repeal it if they give tax cuts or increase spending. And that's the good thing about it. I'll yield back my time.
Is there further? Mr. Diaz-Balart is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You know, lots been said. The pig was fed too well, and I agree with that. The pig was fed too well in the previous 8 years. But you don't solve that by tripling that and defending tripling the debt over what you criticized over 8 years ago. Now, I'm not here to point fingers. I'm not here to point fingers. But what I think is fair, to be serious, is that we have two options here. We can say, you know, everybody else in Congress needs to cut spending, but we're not going to. We don't want to spend more. We want to cut debt. But let everybody else do it, not us here. You know, Mr. Neugebauer has given us a chance, and I want to thank him for that. He's given us a chance to put the taxpayers' money where our collective mouth is. This is not an issue of pointing fingers. This is an issue, are we willing to do our very small part to try to control spending in a very real way? That's all this is. Again, let's put the taxpayers' money where our collective mouths are. We have a chance to do that here ourselves today. Not to point fingers about 8 years or this president or that president. Us. We're the ones that do the budget. We're the ones responsible for spending. Congress is. We have an opportunity. So all the rhetoric, let's put it aside. We have an opportunity because this gentleman has given it to us right now to take a vote to put the taxpayers' dollars, their money, where our collective mouths are really loud most of the time on. Here's an opportunity. I hope we take this opportunity. Thank you, sir, for giving us the opportunity.
Would the gentleman yield?
I have 3 minutes. I would yield it to Mr. Brown. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my friend for yielding, and just in response to my friend from Tennessee, we're talking about the deficit, not the debt. I've been a strong critic of the spending that went on in the 107th, 8th, and 9th Congress. I think it's deplorable and absolutely unconscionable that the last administration created the debt that was created during that period of time. I wasn't asleep. I was practicing medicine in Georgia. And I would have been a fierce opponent, just like I am today, on all this deficit spending. I've introduced a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. I think the federal government should live within its budget, within the revenues that it receives, just like my state of Georgia does. But we're talking about the future. We're not talking about the past. We've got this tremendous debt. Every taxpayer in this country owes $117,000 as their part of that debt. We cannot continue spending money. And what we're looking at and what Mr. Neugebauer is trying to do is to stop the bleeding, So we're looking forward, not looking backwards, as my friend just did, and I don't criticize him for doing so. You and I are friends, sir, and we'll continue to be friends. I'm a great critic of deficit spending. PAYGO has been a joke. It has been a joke. We have violated PAYGO time after time after time in this Congress. With this Congress, we've violated PAYGO over and over and over again. The only way Obamacare is paid for is higher taxes. It's going to kill jobs. It's going to kill millions of jobs in this country because of the higher taxes. We have people in my district, manufacturers as an example. I talked to a manufacturer that hires about 400 people in my district that says that he's going to have to lay people off because of Obamacare. And if we, God forbid, do pass the energy tax, he's going to have to close up and go offshore or go out of business. This Congress is creating debt far more than we have seen in the past administration. I'm not talking about the past administration. I'm a great critic of a past administration and the past Republican-controlled Congresses because it should not have been done. But we're looking forward. We're looking forward towards what's going to be the future. You cannot tax and spend and borrow your way to prosperity, and that's what this Congress is trying to do. And Mr. Nagelbauer has given us an opportunity to stop the bleeding. And so talking about people being asleep, I take offense to that because I wasn't here. I wasn't asleep. I was a private citizen, and I was a great critic of all the deficit spending that was going on during that period of time and the debt that was being created with that. So it's critical that we stop the bleeding. Mr. Nagelbauer has given us an opportunity, and this committee has one opportunity to stop it. One opportunity, and this is it. Now yield back.
All time has expired on that discussion. If there's no further discussion, then the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Opposed, no. No. The nays have it, and the amendment is we'll let the clerk call the roll.
Chairman Gordon.
Nope.
Chairman Gordon votes no. Mr. Costello. No. Mr. Costello votes no. Ms. Johnson. Ms. Johnson votes no. Ms. Woolsey. Mr. Wu. Mr. Baird. Mr. Baird votes no. Mr. Miller. No. Mr. Miller votes no. Mr. Lipinski. No. Mr. Lipinski votes no. Ms. Giffords. Ms. Giffords votes no. Ms. Edwards. No. Ms. Edwards votes no. Ms. Fudge. No. Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Lujan. No. Mr. Lujan votes no. Mr. Tonko.
No.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Rothman. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Davis. No. Mr. Davis votes no. Mr. Chandler. Mr. Carnahan. No. Mr. Carnahan votes no. Mr. Hill. No. Mr. Hill votes no. Mr. Mitchell. No. Mr. Mitchell votes no. Mr. Wilson. Ms. Dahlkemper. Ms. Dahlkemper votes no. Mr. Grayson. No. Mr. Grayson votes no. Ms. Cosmas. Ms. Cosmas votes no. Mr. Peters. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner. Mr. Lamar Smith. Mr. Roybacher. Yes. Mr. Roybacher votes aye. Mr. Bartlett. Mr. Ehlers. Mr. Lucas. Yes. Mr. Lucas votes aye. Mrs. Biggert. No. Mrs. Biggert votes no. Mr. Aiken. Mr. Nagelbauer. Mr. Nagelbauer votes aye. Mr. Inglis. Mr. McCall. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart votes aye. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Adrian Smith. Mr. Adrian Smith votes aye. Mr. Brown. Aye. Mr. Brown votes aye. Mr. Olson?
Has anyone but not been recorded? Mr. Rothman?
Mr. Rothman votes no.
Mr. Wu, how have you been recorded?
Mr. Wu votes no.
Mr. Garamendi?
Mr. Garamendi votes no.
Mr. Matheson?
Mr. Matheson votes no.
Dr. Ehlers?
Mr. Ehlers votes aye.
15. And anyone else? Then the clerk will report the vote.
You have 823. Mr. Chairman, 8 members vote aye and 23 members vote no.
Just for information of the committee, we have, the amendment fails. For the information of the members, we have 3 more amendments from Mr. Robacher, and then, 4 from Mr. Rowe, thank you. And then we will, there were a couple of amendments that passed. If those members are here, then we'll cover those, and then we'll be at final passage. So, the gentleman from California, Mr. Robacher, is recognized. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Thank you very much. I would think this would be, yes, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Is this Amendment 034?
This is Amendment 034.
Okay. 034, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Rohrbacher of California.
Ask unanimous consent to dispense with reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
I think this should be relatively uncontroversial or non-controversial as compared to some of the other things, perhaps. It just simply says that any of the funds that this spent by the Competes Act must go to United States citizens or United States entities. So we're just talking about giving this to American companies or U.S. citizens rather than people who are not citizens or foreign corporations. And I think that that pretty well speaks for itself, and I would hope that my colleagues would believe this is non-controversial. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I know that the gentleman is obviously sincere about this and well-intentioned. The problem is this. Many of these projects are done in teams, and the effort is to get the best and brightest of the national labs, the public sector, the private sector, all around. And so there may very well be a PhD or someone in this country who is working at a university who is not a citizen here, who is the top expert in this area. And we would be, it's not like they're making some big profit. We would be cutting our nose off despite our face if we did not let them participate. Additionally, what you have is you have a situation where many companies in this, in the United States, that are American companies, do have plants overseas that might want to use some of this technology. If they're not allowed to do it, then they could very well be behind, and even though those profits are coming back here. So the intention is well, and I think there's some specific language in ARPA that stops the flow. If I could call on Mr. King to be more specific about that language.
In the amendment, in the nature of a substitute, there is language inserted into ARPA, that ARPA-E, that refers to research and development of advanced manufacturing processes and technologies for the domestic manufacturing of novel energy technologies. If that's what you're referring to, sir.
Okay. I yield back to Mr. Robacher.
Well, if that's what it is, no one should have any objection to voting for my amendment. And just have to tell Mr. Chairman, I feel very strongly about this. And like I said earlier, when other objections were being made about Mr. Hall's amendment, we can always take things out to some and find some 1% case or 2% case where something isn't the way we really want. But in the spirit of this legislation is we want to help the people of the United States of America. The purpose of this Yeah, there may be a visiting, there may be a visiting professor or something like that. I don't care. I don't care about him. I care about our people, and I know you guys do too. And the bottom line is, we need to set this standard. We're out for the people of the United States of America. We're for our companies. We're in a hole right now, and our first and only consideration should be them. I don't care about some foreign guy who wants to come in here and might be able to contribute. I'd rather that job go to an American, period. And that goes for the companies too. So I hope you can support it. Thank you.
Mr. Wu is recognized.
I understand the gentleman's intent, and I just want to get a little bit more specific with the chairman's very well-placed general concerns about getting the best and brightest. If we go back to World War II and the Manhattan Project, I think the gentleman recognizes that there were a tremendous number of Americans and foreigners who worked together. Albert Einstein came to this country in 1933. He wrote his warning letter about a potential Nazi bomb project in 1939. He did not receive his citizenship until 1940. Now, maybe we should have cut off funds to Dr. Einstein between 1933 and 1940, but it might have had serious consequences for the security of this nation. Other participants in the Manhattan Project, Edwin Teller got his U.S. citizenship in 1941, well after the commencement of the Manhattan Project. Enrico Fermi got his U.S. citizenship in 1944, again, well after the commencement of the Manhattan Project. And I guess I just want to rely on my own personal experience in that my father came to this country as a foreign graduate student, and he worked on material science for the U.S. military, and he's very, very proud of that work. But he did all that work before he became a U.S. citizen. And since then, he's worked in the private sector, again in the defense industry. I understand where the gentleman is coming from. I think that this would be devastating to our scientific leadership and devastating to our national security. It's a great political point. I take it that the gentleman is sincere, but this is a counterproductive amendment, and I regretfully oppose it.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield to the gentleman from Tennessee.
In Oak Ridge, we have a national lab that has the SNS spallation neutron source. We also have a facility that's been built there for visiting scientists who come here from all across the world. Will this have an impact on them being able to use the facilities at the SNS project or other national labs, such as our computer that we have in Oak Ridge? And will we, in turn, as we visit their scientific research facilities, will they then deny us an opportunity to engage in research? I'm just wondering how this will work. I mean, we have a lot of visiting scientists who come to Oak Ridge, and we in turn kind of exchange back and forth. If this doesn't deny them the right to actually participate in our research and the facilities that we've built and ARPA funds, I'm okay with this amendment. But if it does, it means we stop actually having exchange ideas back and forth between many foreign scientists. Can someone answer that?
Mr. King, you want to answer that?
As I read the language, it would prohibit funds being spent on projects in which foreign scientists are involved.
If Mr. Wu would yield, I think the bottom line is this. Mr. Robacher, and I think all of us, our objective is we want the best for the American people. To me, the best is to get the best product out. You know, the way we win is to have, new technologies, new breakthroughs. And so if it's Enrico Fermi, if it's Albert Einstein, if it's Van Buren, if they can help us get that very best product, that's how Americans win. And if there's, Dr. Ehlers is recognized.
I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but let me just express the opinion of a scientist. and that is that science is an international enterprise. Scientists around the world work together. They publish primarily in English, but if they publish in Russian or Greek or something else, it's usually translated into English. Everyone works together worldwide, and most scientists don't care who pays them, just so they get something paid. But they truly enjoy working on science, and they're always after the best and brightest. A current example I just turned in today to a resolution commending the 100th anniversary of the development of the maser, which led to the maser, which led to the laser. Charles Towns, who's a friend of mine, he's currently at Berkeley, developed the maser here in the United States. A few months later, the Russians developed a different version of the maser. It had an advantage that it operated continuously instead of in pulses, the way the Towns one did. Some bright Americans took the ideas from both scientists in commerce and developed the current laser. And of course, it's gone through many iterations since then. If you look at that, I calculated at one point that Mr. Towns got something like $100,000 to $200,000 from the federal government to develop the maser. Today, the laser industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry developed on the basis of the work done by both the Russians and by Dr. Towns and his aides. Both of them won Nobel Prizes for it, even though they developed the maser rather than the laser, but that was the big breakthrough. And so it would be impossible to sort out who contributed what, and if they were employed, who should get paid and who would pay them. So it truly is a completely international effort. I'm in great sympathy with what Mr. Rohrbacher is trying to do. We should not be willy-nilly handing out money to foreign entities, especially entities, but even individuals, unless we can gain something from it. In the case of the laser and the maser, we did gain a great deal from it because we took the lead on the laser, and the laser industry is developed here. It's now worldwide. So you use lasers from everything to laying out sewer lines, putting in ceilings so that they're all level, to surgery, whether it's removing tonsils or hemorrhoids. Lasers have an incredible number of uses, and it's, as I say, a huge industry. So you have to be very careful when analyzing this. You may lose more than you gain by restricting the funds in one broad stroke. I think there are matters of principle like Mr. Rohrbacher's, which I think are very important, but which can better be enforced by the individuals running the various operations, such as the example you heard from Oak Ridge, and where we built it, we own it, we operate it, but if we can benefit from a scientist coming over from some other country and operating it and doing their research there, we gain and they gain. So it's not a zero-sum game. Sorry for the long speech, but that's just the way science works. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Bayer's recognized.
Just very briefly, I see at least 3 of the paintings in this room deal with our space program. There's a gentleman named Werner von Braun who had a fairly significant impact on the U.S. space program. He didn't originate in the United States of America. His past was not necessarily the best, but his contributions to the future was profound. And we were darn lucky that we had that contribution. We worked awfully hard to make sure we got it instead of the other guys. Second point, I'm familiar with a company in my district that had an opportunity to expand dramatically and create a number of American jobs. But because one of their co-founders, one of the geniuses behind the company, was Indian of origin and was not yet a U.S. citizen, he was here legally, and it was a co-founded company, they became ineligible for it here domestically, and they ended up offshoring. We actually lost American jobs because of this requirement. There was a 100% requirement. The final point I'll make is there's a rather striking irony to me that on the one hand we're saying, by God, and rightfully so, let's make sure the greatest number of American money goes to American scientists. The bill before us today's primary function, the America Competes Act, is to increase the numbers of American scientists, and yet we are also debating freezing funding for that bill. You can't, on the one hand, say, let's freeze funding and not educate more American scientists, and then say, but only American scientists are who we're going to help. You've got to expand the pool of American scientists. America Competes is precisely designed to do it. That's why we're insisting on additional funding. And I just see a remarkable lack of foresight in this. And I support the Buy America Act. When it comes to heavy U.S. manufacturing, we've got to keep some of that domestic supply. But as Mr. Ehler so ably said, and Mr. Wu and many others, and the chairman, there are a lot of smart people in the world, and we need to work with them. And if we say the only project that's going to get money has to be headquartered in the U.S., Large Hadron Collider's out. A host of international collaborations that our scientists and our citizens benefit from. And I've been a critic of the Hadron Collider, not because of its location, because of its cost. But if we just say everything has to come here and only U.S. guys and men and women benefit, it is the U.S. population and the U.S. economy that's going to lose profoundly in the long run, and I would urge defeat it.
Mr. Hall is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield to Mr. Rohrabacher.
Do you want to?
Thank you, Mr. Hall. Hey, come on, we're not talking about fighting World War II here. We're talking about the U.S. competes. It competes. That's what we're trying to make America competitive. And you don't make America competitive and have more scientists here and get more people into science here by subsidizing foreigners, all right? So we're going to expend a certain amount of money, and that it should go to Americans is just such a simple proposition. I think that we should be able to understand that. And it is not World War II, and we're not talking about that. Look, the bottom line is we hope there are more Americans here who will get into the sciences. If we subsidize foreigners who come in, we are going to have fewer Americans getting into the sciences. That's just the way it works. We can have, I am flabbergasted with the response to this. I thought this was going to be totally non-controversial, given the limited amount of money that we have to try to promote something that's supposed to have us compete and to stimulate science education in our country. And we're worried that we're going to spend, you don't want to spend the money on Americans. Come on.
That's not, Mr.
Well, I'm afraid that's what this is all about. And we can be very sophisticated and come up with very sophisticated scenarios how in some way America is going to benefit better. You're going to have American scientists be better by giving the money to a foreigner who comes here. Now, I will tell you this. We got plenty of American scientists and engineers who deserve to have some little help when they're trying to develop a new product. And that's what this is all about. We got, there are, for everyone, Wernher von Braun, I think he did eventually become a U.S. citizen.
So did Edward Teller.
Let's
did
wait for Wernher von Braun's to become U.S. citizens before we give them our money. And that would maybe encourage people to come here and become U.S. citizens, which is a good thing. But again, what we have, I mean, I'm literally flabbergasted at what I'm hearing. And I bet there are a lot of people out there who are listening to this and saying, well, does it really mean that if we just give our money to an American company, which is the next one that says, we're going to provide the money, but only if they're going to develop if it's going to be used for developing manufacturing outside of our country, we're not going to give it to those companies. I imagine you're going to be against that as well. There is nothing wrong with us representing the interests of the American people and yes, you don't have to try to have an analysis that carries it 5 steps down to down the road to see, well maybe there's an explanation that would make some sense where we're actually giving the money to a foreigner rather than an American. I will just say that we've got lots of kids and lots of businesses and lots of people with creative ideas here who are U.S. citizens. And if we're going to have the Competes Act, I took it for granted when we say competes, we're talking about America competing. I take it for granted that's what that means, doesn't it? I mean, we're not talking about improving the world. We're talking about making America compete. So what's wrong if that's the purpose of the bill, making sure the money goes to Americans? So,
would the gentleman yield?
of course, I'm sorry for getting passionate about this, but
Mr. Grayson's been,
I
has
will
been
certainly
patient
yield.
here.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was listening carefully to Mr. Rohrabacher's comments, and I would never want to be accused of sophistication. But there is one scenario that concerns me about this amendment, and that's this, and I'd like to ask him to address it if he would.
Yes.
It appears to me that this amendment quite possibly violates several free trade acts that we've entered into, the North American Free Trade Act, several other trade acts, and probably the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Now, what happens when our government violates those provisions is that we are subject to international litigation, and the taxpayers end up paying for that, not just the cost of litigation, but also the liability. And I am concerned about the possibility that exactly that would happen. I understand that that's a sophisticated scenario, but I'm concerned about it.
Well,
has the gentleman inquired as to whether this amendment actually would, in fact, comply with all of our international trade agreements, specifically those governing government acquisition?
Okay, I'll be happy to address it. Reclaiming my time. You know, when I first ran for office, one of my most effective political slogans was, "Vote for Dana, at least he's not a lawyer." And I'll have to tell you right now, that is a question for legal counsel. And maybe we want to ask legal counsel what are the constitutional implications of this? How does this impact on our various treaties, et cetera? But I think that it's pretty common sense that we can pass things through the United States Congress that are aimed at benefiting the American people to the exclusion of having to provide that same amount of money to foreigners. I happen to believe that that has to be legal in the broadest sense, and hopefully in the specific sense if we have entered into treaties now where the money that we put through this Congress has to go to foreigners as well as to American citizens. I think that we have gone way in the wrong direction, and that needs to be addressed.
Well, that may well be true. If Mr. Chairman, I can respond briefly.
Okay.
That may well be true. That it may well be true that we've gone too far, but in fact, in many cases, that is the law. In fact, that's one of the fundamental purposes of many of these treaties. And what we're actually doing, if we pass an amendment like this, is we're giving a blank check to foreign entities to come and to come to our courts.
I don't want to give any checks to the foreigners. You're the
well, no, I mean, once it's law, it's law. And if you do this and you create a liability for us under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and under NAFTA and otherwise, it's too late to take it back. There's no do-overs in international law. And I think that at least it would be incumbent upon the member to inquire into this possibility before offering such an amendment and giving us unlimited liability for the U.S. taxpayers.
Mr. Rohrabacher's time has expired. If there's no further discussion, the vote is on Mr. Rohrabacher's amendment. All in favor say aye. Opposed, no. No. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
I have a feeling that I'm going to get the same reaction from this one, which just basically says that...
just one second.
Yes,
the clerk
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Okay.
Amendment number 035, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Rohrabacher of California.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading, and without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Well, basically, I guess I'm going to receive the same kind of a reception, but again, I didn't expect it, because I expected this also to be quite non-controversial. This amendment requires that anyone receiving funding under the Competes Act, I'm sure competes, I think that meant America competes, although that wasn't in there, the Competes Act, cannot use the money and has to agree that he's not going to use the money for development of technology to be used in manufacturing outside the United States. So if he's going to take the money, it can't be used for manufacturing outside the United States. And at that, I think it's common sense that we don't give money to people who want to set up manufacturing facilities overseas in times like these. And in fact, we do, and to be fair about it, there's lots of precedent for that. We actually have the Export-Import Bank and other institutions in our society that have been subsidizing the investment in manufacturing facilities overseas for decades, and that's why we are in the hole that we're in. And I would hope that the U.S. Competes Act does not proceed in that direction, but proceeds instead in making us more competitive rather than building technologies to upgrade foreign manufacturing. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Robacher. Once again, I know it's only with the best intentions that you introduce this amendment. I think there are some potential problems here that we need to keep in mind. First of all, we have a global market now, and many of our major corporations in this country have international operations already. Because it's necessary when they're selling goods in another country, whether it is next day, a type of service, or whatever it might be. So we would, I'm afraid, not allow our U.S. companies to have the best manufacturing ability elsewhere to compete. And so I think that we would be harming ourselves with this. And if there's no further discussion, then the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment, say aye. Those opposed, no. The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed. The gentleman from California, Mr. Robacher.
I have an amendment at the desk, and I am noting that I haven't called any roll call votes on these other votes.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 036, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Roybacher of California.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes.
Well, this amendment says that anyone who has infringed and has been found guilty of infringing on the patent rights of others cannot receive funding under the U.S. Competes Act. Now, I'll have to admit that it doesn't say that any U.S. citizen who has infringed. So that what I'm trying to do is just thieves, but I'll have to admit that it's aimed at any thief. And if there are foreign thieves that come in and want to steal from our citizens their patent rights, I don't know if that's going to actually prevent them from getting this money as well. But let us just say, in principle, what my amendment says is that if you have infringed on someone else's patent and you've been found guilty of that, we should not be giving you money to develop your technology. Let's not finance thieves, this should be the motto.
The chairman recognizes himself. In principle, you are absolutely correct, Mr. Robacher. Unfortunately, in practice, some of the there are what you might call it wouldn't be coincidental, but minor infringements that were not intended. And let me tell you, if this amendment were in effect, Apple, Microsoft, Honeywell, IBM, Monsanto, ADA, Dow, DuPont, General Electric, and others would not be eligible.
They shouldn't be eligible. We're talking about people who can afford to pay for their own research.
But our country would be worse off if we did not have these companies able to export and bring back that revenue here.
But they can pay for their own thing. I mean, why should we be giving those huge corporations the money? They've got their own money. This is supposed to be aimed at people who cannot get money for their for very high-risk propositions and things, and ARPA and E and NISP and all this federal money that goes every place. It's not supposed to go to our biggest corporations, whether it's NIST or whether it's ARPA E or any of these other things. We're not subsidizing big corporations, are we? We're trying to basically further science. So if they've infringed upon, those big corporations have infringed on little guys' patents, hey, let's give them the incentive not to infringe on little guys' patents.
Would the gentleman yield?
Dr. Bayer is recognized.
I mean, let's step back for a sec. Again, I'm a strong proponent of intellectual property rights. I know the gentleman has worked with some brilliant inventors and who depend on that, and so I support the intent of that. Protecting intellectual property rights is vital. The challenge, however, is twofold. One, it occasionally happens that ultimately an infringement case goes against the company, and they didn't say, let's go steal an intellectual property right. A judge ruled that there was that somebody already held the patent and you somehow violated the patent, okay? But under this, I think if that's the case, then you could be ruled out. Second point is, this is not just about ARPA-E. This is about the entire, as I read it, this is about all the span of NSF activities. Let's suppose, for example, that NSF is working on a major project, a mega science project, and they need the latest. I mean, the gentleman's a strong advocate of nuclear power. Well, GE builds things like magnets and containment vessels, et cetera. If we're doing research on nuclear power, and if GE's the prime contractor that supplies those, but the mere fact that at some point in its career, GE had a patent infringement case that went against it, GE now can't supply. So who the heck's going to supply it? Certainly not a French company or Japanese. I mean, the problem is it's overly broad. The gentleman's absolutely right that we have to defend intellectual property rights. He's absolutely right, and I think this committee intends to take up measures of that towards that end. But I just think this is so broad that it would actually profoundly harm our competitiveness and virtually paralyze a whole lot of you know, if you can't work with Microsoft, for example, on national security of the computer systems, if you can't work with Apple on that, if you can't work with GE on energy, if you can't work with Monsanto on a host of chemical products, my goodness gracious, we're gonna freeze out an awful lot of productive Americans.
Would you yield at that point?
It's not mine to yield, so I'll yield back. Thank the gentleman.
Well, if it's my time, I yield to you.
I think the gentleman has a point, and perhaps the legislation should say that they have been found guilty of intentionally infringing on someone's patent rights, and not all infringement cases are based on the idea that someone has intentionally done this, but there's been an infringement without an intent to do so. So that definition is, I accept that criticism. When my amendment goes down in flames, I'll think about that when I write the next one. But let me just note that in terms of these big companies that you're talking about, I think that one of the big problems we have is that we are trying to mold our efforts towards these huge mega corporations. And that is not where innovation in this country comes from. That's not what what's going to bring us to a higher level of prosperity and competition and competitiveness in this world. These big companies are not frankly, I think that we've got to make sure that when we're doing these things, we are developing policies that rein these companies in rather than subsidize them in their current status of basically dominating whole segments of our country. So I think you've made a good point, and so I will withdraw my amendment at this time because it does not include the word intentional infringement. Thank you.
You could have done that earlier. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
All right, now let's. This may be something that people
closer.
can accept. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 037, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Rohrabacher of California.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Okay, basically, this amendment apportions the intellectual property rights when we are involved with these activities with various corporations and various individuals, that it apportions the intellectual property rights that comes out of research projects and these various programs that we're talking about. It apportions the rights to the granting agency, meaning the agency that the federal government will then, the U.S. taxpayers via that agency, will then own a portion of the intellectual property rights that is in direct proportion to the overall funding of the project. So if, for example, if the federal government provides 20% of a project's funding, the American taxpayer then will have 20% of the value in terms of the intellectual property rights resulting from that technology. It seems to me, again, especially when we're talking about these big corporations, we should not just be giving money away to people like this, and there should be a payback for us. And if indeed we are involved with helping develop some fantastic new technology that helps us compete, but at the same time makes an entity like General Electric or someone else billions of dollars because the intellectual property rights now are of great value. Why shouldn't the American taxpayer, if we've subsidized that whole operation and the development of that product and that new technology, why shouldn't we get a portion of that? We should be, and that's all my amendment does. I think it makes sense, and maybe this will resonate more on the other side of the aisle than my other amendment.
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
I certainly will.
What happens if this amendment is not passed? What's the apportionment if it's not passed?
I'm not sure.
Chairman yields to himself. There's nobody here with a truer heart than you, Mr. Robacher, and I mean that. And you're trying to do the right thing. I think you are doing the right thing. Let me tell you what I think is the potential problem on this situation, and that is that there are two major laws that deal with these. Stevenson-Weidler Innovation Act and the Bayh-Dole Act, and I understand that Mr. Wu is going to take up at least hearings and hopefully potentially legislation on these and on a more comprehensive basis later, and I think that it would be better off, to do this on a comprehensive basis with, after we have the hearings rather than a single shot here. But clearly you raise a very significant concern. And I yield to.
Go ahead. I'm glad the chairman thinks it is a significant concern. That's why I'd like to make sure it's in the legislation.
Okay. Okay. So if there is no further, Ms. Edwards is recognized.
Well, I didn't think I'd see the day, but Mr. Rohrabacher, you've touched a kind nerve of mine here because I'm very sympathetic on this.
Let me tell you something. She's good help too, Rohrabacher.
I am concerned about instances where the federal government puts up all the money and a lot of the risk, and the taxpayers get really none of the benefit.
Right.
Nonetheless, though, I would like to deal with it. I would like to deal with it in a much more comprehensive way, because it isn't just here that happens. Happens all the time and all throughout our agencies and our research institutions, and then there's a lot of profit to be made off of that, which we could actually funnel back into research.
Mm-hmm.
So my commitment, while I'm not going to support this here because I think it does deserve much more comprehensive consideration, I would look forward to working with you to deal with this in a way that enables taxpayers to retrieve the benefit of their investment in the same way that corporations get the benefit of those investments. And so I thank you for offering the amendment, and I think you raise a really strong point on behalf of taxpayers, and I look forward to working with you. Thank you. With that, I yield.
If there's no further discussion, the vote is on the motion. All in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. The noes have it. And
Mr. Chairman, I would ask for a recorded vote on that.
And you will get it. The clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Gordon. Chairman Gordon votes no. Mr. Costello. Mr. Costello votes no. Ms. Johnson. Ms. Johnson votes no? Okay. Ms. Woolsey. Ms. Woolsey votes no. Mr. Wu. Mr. Wu votes no. Mr. Baird. Mr. Baird votes no. Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller votes no. Mr. Lipinski. Mr. Lipinski votes no. Ms. Giffords. Ms. Giffords votes no. Ms. Edwards. Ms. Fudge. Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes no. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Rothman.
Oh, good.
Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis votes no. Mr. Chandler. Mr. Carnahan. Mr. Carnahan votes no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill votes no. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell votes no. Mr. Wilson. Mrs. Dahlkemper. Mrs. Dahlkemper votes no. Mr. Grayson. Mr. Grayson votes no. Ms. Cosmas. Ms. Cosmas votes no. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters votes no. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner. Mr. Lamar Smith. Mr. Roybacher?
Yes.
Mr. Roybacher votes aye. Mr. Bartlett? Mr. Ehlers? Mr. Ehlers votes aye. Mr. Lucas? Mr. Lucas votes aye. Mrs. Biggert? Mr. Aiken? Mr. Nagelbauer? Mr. Nagelbauer votes aye. Mr. Inglis? Mr. McCall? Mr. McCall votes aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart? Mr. Diaz-Balart votes aye. Mr. Bilbray?
Even a broken clock is right twice a day. I vote aye.
Mr. Bilbray votes aye. Mr. Adrian Smith? Mr. Brown? Mr. Brown votes aye. Mr. Olson? Mr. Olson votes aye.
Mr. Chairman? Aye.
Ms. Edwards votes aye. Ms. Biggert votes aye.
If not, the clerk will record the vote or report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, 12 members vote aye and 22 members vote no.
Thank you. The next amendment on the roster, the amendment is not passed. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia, Dr. Braun. Let me say that Dr. Braun is told me he wants to be brief, but he wants to have a recorded vote, so those that are here may want to stay here. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 028, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Brown of Georgia.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with reading. Without objection, so ordered. Recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would simply streamline the overall COMPETES program by removing the new programs. In these tough economic times, we can't do everything that we want to do, so we need to prioritize our resources. The amendment prioritizes core research at the 3 priority agencies and gives them substantial increases, which has long been the top recommendation of the science and business community. I'm concerned about the new program's redundancy with other existing programs. For example, the loan guarantees are similar to the Small Business Administration's loan guarantee program for which manufacturers are eligible. Also, the hubs appear to be redundant with existing DOE activities. Specifically, the FY 2011 budget proposes $34 million for a hub on batteries and energy storage, but EERE's budget for energy storage in same year, FY 2011, is $94 million on top of the $1.9 billion that it received in the stimulus for vehicle battery manufacturing grants. RPE has an explicit solicitation for energy storage projects. There are at least 5 Energy Frontier research centers funded by the Office of Science that are working on energy storage. And fourthly, the Office of Electricity Delivery and the Loan Guarantee Program both support energy storage and battery development activities. So why do we need this activity funded by a 5th program? And why do we need so many different entities pursuing the same technology? Eliminating the new loan guarantee and hubs program alone would reduce the authorized amounts in the bill by over $1 billion, $250 million for the loan guarantees and $850 million for the hubs. Additionally, removing the prize awards in Section 228, $12 million over 3 years of the pilot program, and innovative services initiative in Section 406, no cost, the bioresearch program in Section 407, and the regional innovation program, such sums in Section 503, would further reduce the authorization levels and promote better fiscal management. As I've said before, our deficits are projected to remain above $1 trillion for the foreseeable future, and our debt held by the public is ever growing. Additionally, this reauthorization goes beyond the President's request. It only makes good financial sense to re-examine this reauthorization and not invest in any new spending on new programs until our financial house gets back into better shape. I urge the committee to support this amendment so that we can be examples of fiscal responsibility not only within this committee, but for other committees, and lead by example. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for allowing me to discuss this amendment. I have no misconceptions about the final result of the vote. Thus, I suggest to the committee chairman that we dispense with any further discussion, call the question, and proceed with the recorded vote, and I so move.
Always try to serve you. The clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Gordon. Chairman Gordon votes no. Mr. Costello. Ms. Johnson. Ms. Johnson votes no. Ms. Woolsey. Ms. Woolsey votes no. Mr. Wu. Mr. Wu votes no. Mr. Baird. Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller votes no. Mr. Lipinski. Mr. Lipinski votes no. Ms. Giffords. Ms. Edwards. Ms. Edwards votes no. Ms. Fudge. Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes no. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Rothman. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis votes no. Mr. Chandler. Mr. Carnahan. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill votes no. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell votes no. Mr. Wilson. Mrs. Dahlkemper. Mrs. Dahlkemper votes no. Mr. Grayson. Mr. Grayson votes no. Ms. Cosmas. Ms. Cosmas votes no. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters votes no. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner. Mr. Lamar Smith. Mr. Roybacher. Mr. Roybacher votes aye. Mr. Bartlett. Mr. Ehlers. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas votes aye. Mrs. Biggert. Mrs. Biggert votes no. Mr. Aiken. Mr. Nagelbauer. Mr. Nagelbauer votes aye. Mr. Inglis. Mr. McCall. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart votes aye. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bilbray votes aye. Mr. Adrian Smith. Mr. Adrian Smith votes aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown votes aye. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes aye.
Is there anyone who has not been recorded? Mr. Costello.
No. Mr. Costello votes no.
Dr. Baird.
No.
Mr. Barrett votes no.
Mr. Chandler.
No. Mr. Chandler votes no.
Ms. Gifford.
No.
Ms. Carnahan. Mr. Carnahan. If there's no one else, the clerk will tally the vote. Following which there are two additional votes that, two additional amendments that should be accepted.
Mr. Chairman, 9 members vote aye and 25 members vote no.
The amendment is not accepted. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Bilbray, along with the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi.
Mr. Chairman, I'd ask you to recognize the gentleman from California to present this amendment.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 042, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Bilbray of California and Mr. Garamendi of California.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Mr. Chairman and members, this amendment would direct the department to engage in fusion research. Reliable, safe, sustainable. It adds one additional new program, which I would suggest the previous amendment would not have allowed. But here we go with a new program that I think is very, very important. Nuclear power in all of its various forms are part of the solutions for the future. Ask for an aye vote.
If there's no further discussion after that articulate presentation, Then the, all those in favor of the amendment say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The motion is, the amendment is accepted. The final amendment is amendment by Dr. Bartlett, who will be introduced by Mr. Hall.
Create all new programs, and you put an amendment for a new program. Well, why not?
Are you ready to proceed, Mr. Hall?
I am ready to proceed, and I have an amendment in front of me.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 021, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Bartlett of Maryland.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
I will not take 5 minutes. This amendment's needed to reflect the intent of ARPA-E's director. This amendment clarifies that funding for events such as those for grants, finalists, and other outreach programs would be taken from the 5% set aside for tech transfers.
Very well said. If there's no further amendment or no further discussion, the vote is on the motion or on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there any other amendments? If no, then the vote is on the amendment on the nature of a substitute on H.R. 5116 as amended. All those in favor would say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman.
Do you want to vote
On that, I ask to
You want to do this one a little bit later?
I withdraw anything I've said in the last 30 seconds. In the last 30 seconds.
All right. The vote is on the bill as amended. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Did you like to, Mr. Hall?
Mr. Chairman, on that, I ask for recorded vote.
The clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Gordon.
Aye.
Chairman Gordon votes aye. Mr. Costello. Mr. Costello votes aye. Ms. Johnson. Ms. Johnson votes aye. Ms. Woolsey. Ms. Woolsey votes aye. Mr. Wu. Mr. Wu votes aye. Mr. Baird.
Consistent with the wishes of the American Chamber of Congress, the National Association of Manufacturers, and a host of other, I will vote aye.
Mr. Baird votes aye. Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller votes aye. Mr. Lipinski. Mr. Lipinski votes aye. Ms. Giffords. Ms. Giffords votes aye. Ms. Edwards. Ms. Edwards votes aye. Ms. Fudge. Ms. Fudge votes aye. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes aye. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes aye. Mr. Garamendi.
Aye.
Mr. Garamendi votes aye. Mr. Rothman. Mr. Matheson. Aye. Mr. Matheson votes aye. Mr. Davis. Aye. Mr. Davis votes aye. Mr. Chandler. Aye. Mr. Chandler votes aye. Mr. Carnahan. Aye. Mr. Carnahan votes aye. Mr. Hill. Aye. Mr. Hill votes aye. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell votes aye. Mr. Wilson. Ms. Dahlkemper. Ms. Dahlkemper votes aye. Mr. Grayson. Mr. Grayson votes aye. Ms. Cosmas. Ms. Cosmas votes aye. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters votes aye. Mr. Hall.
No.
Mr. Hall votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner. Mr. Lamar Smith. Mr. Roybacher.
No.
Mr. Roybacher votes no. Mr. Bartlett. Mr. Ehlers. Mr. Ehlers votes aye. Mr. Lucas. No. Mr. Lucas votes no. Mrs. Biggert. Mrs. Biggert votes aye. Mr. Aiken. Is he here? Mr. Nagelbauer. Mr. Nagelbauer votes no. Mr. Inglis. Mr. Inglis votes aye. Mr. McCall. Mr. McCall votes aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart votes no. Mr. Bilbray.
Despite the Chamber of Commerce position, Bilbray votes aye.
Mr. Bilbray votes aye. Mr. Adrian Smith. Mr. Adrian Smith votes no. Mr. Brown. No. Mr. Brown votes no. Mr. Olson. No. Mr. Olson votes no.
Is there anyone who was not recorded? If not, the clerk will report.
You're wrong.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, while they're counting, can I say something?
Yes, Ms. Woosley.
We are very proud of you. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Okay, it's
Yeah.
okay, it's okay.
Thank you. I just keep reminding you, this is not a eulogy. I am not dead yet. We have more to do.
Mr. Chairman, 31 members vote aye and 6 members vote no.
The bill, the ayes have it. The motion's carried. I recognize myself to offer a motion. I move the committee favorable report, H.R. 5116, as the amendment to the House with the recommendation that the bill do pass. Furthermore, I move that the staff be instructed to prepare the legislative report and to make necessary technical and conforming changes, and that the chairman take all the necessary steps to bring the bill before the House for consideration. The question is on the motion to report the bill favorably. Those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. Let me just, if there is a question about that vote, do you want to resolve that?
I can recount.
Let's recount. Let's be absolutely sure.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, 29 members vote aye and 7 members and 8 members vote no.
Okay. Okay, we'll say it again, please, so that we all know. Is that okay? All right. Thanks for the oversight on that. I'm glad that we could get it correct. The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. Without objection, the motion is considered to be laid on the table. Members will have 2 subsequent calendar days in which to submit supplemental, minority, and additional views on the measure. Before we adjourn, let me thank everybody very sincerely. It's been a long day. You've been a part of history, and I very much appreciate you being here. And I want to thank, and now we conclude this markup.
Good show, buddy. Good show.
And I've got a little bit of voice left.
This was your bill.
Well, I hope it's